Greetings, citizens. Hey you beautiful creepy human being you. Welcome to my channel and welcome to today's true crime video. I'm so happy we could meet like this. I'm so happy that somehow in all of this that we're forced to deal with on the day today, you and I were able to find each other on this crazy little planet that we call home. My name is Brittany or Bradderstein, whichever you prefer, and today we're going to be doing a true crime marathon. But before we get started, if you have not yet had the pleasure, please make sure to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing that bell. I put out a new video every single week, sometimes 2 a week like this week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you, specifically you, but I can only do that if you join the Brat Pack and become one of us. One of us. One of us. One of us. Alright, now that I'm done begging you to join my cult, let's go ahead and get into this video. Now this video is one in a series that I have done where I've been putting together little compilations that kind of give you an idea, not really an idea of what my channel has to offer, because a lot of people who are watching them are people who have been here before, but if you've never been here before, it kind of gives you an idea of what my channel has to offer. I take videos, I put them together, make a super long video so that you can play it, because I have found that, like me, a lot of you that are clicking on this video, a lot of you who watch my channel have an issue with silence. You can't just be with yourself in your own thoughts, in your own home. I'm the type of person who puts on a super long video, super long podcast, something in the background of my life. It is the soundtrack to my life, is somebody else talking. I just need it. I can't explain what it is. I just can't be in silence. And I know some of you are the same. And for me, when I do it, I pick like a comfort person, a comfort YouTuber, a comfort podcast person. And I know for a lot of the people who watch, somehow I'm your comfort person. So this is, you know, to cater to people like that who need a super long video. If you just need it to be on while you're cooking, doing the dishes, if you're going to run errands and you're leaving your dog at home and they need to hear somebody's voice, a familiar voice. If I'm familiar to them, I get it because it's something that I do too. So all of that's to say that's why this video exists in the first place. I guess I could just put a compilation together, do no intro and let it play, but it's not really my style. And I know that when you're watching this, if you're watching this when I upload it, it's the week of Christmas. If you don't celebrate Christmas, it's the week of holidays. It's a holiday season. So I wanted to, you know, give an extra video. Monday there was a video. Today's Thursday or Friday, probably Friday. And here is another video for you. So if you have an issue with silence, you just need a super long video to, you know, play during your day, or you just want more of me throughout the week, this video is for you. Gather around and let me tell you the story of the tragic murder of Kendra Hatcher. On September 2nd, 2015 in Dallas, Texas, just one day before a planned trip to Cancun with her new boyfriend for the Labor Day weekend, a young woman was gunned down in the parking garage of her apartment building, the Gables Park 17 Apartments, in what appeared, at first at least, to be a robbery gone wrong. She was found on the ground, lying face up, and her purse was missing. But upon further investigation, it was found that she had been shot at close range in the head from an overhead angle with her hands behind her head, execution style. So, not a super common way for somebody to be killed in a run-of-the-mill robbery. They thought it looked more like a professional mob hit, or even an execution. At the exact same moment that this was taking place, a 16-year-old kid who also lived in the building, a boy named Hashim, was riding down the elevator with a friend of his when all of a sudden he heard the unmistakable sounds of a woman screaming, gunshots, car doors closing, tires screeching, and then silence. When he followed the sounds, he stumbled upon a woman dead on the ground wearing only scrubs. Hashim and his friend then looked up to see a black Jeep Cherokee, gun in it, going as fast as it could out of the parking garage. He couldn't see through the windows what these people looked like exactly. They had masks on and they pulled the masks off just right before they hit the street. But from what he could tell through the dark tinted windows is that there were 2 individuals in the car and that he believed one of them was a white male. When police arrived on the scene, the woman was found on the first level of the parking garage, and immediately officers found this odd, just simply because the parking garage was a gated parking garage. You couldn't just get in there. You needed to have either a key pad or a clicker. Like, it wasn't a public garage. So for somebody to get in, they would have had to have had access. So it kind of ruled out somebody random being involved. As officers approached the woman on the ground, they found that her car door was still open, and it looked like she had literally just gotten out of her car. She hadn't even had a chance to do anything. She got out and was immediately executed. So it all happened very quickly. And on the ground next to her was a discarded magazine from the murder weapon. When police ran the license plate on the car, that's when they first learned the identity of the victim. They learned that this was a 35-year-old pediatric dentist named Kendra Hatcher. So now they had the task of figuring out who was Kendra Hatcher. Kendra Hatcher was one of 5 children born into a big, close-knit family to parents Reagan and Bonnie, and the family lived in a small town called Pleasant Plains, Illinois. She went to a small farm school and was very gifted academically. Her brother Neil said that she was always studying. Despite that, though, she still made time for extracurricular activities, like being the captain of the cheerleading team, being on the volleyball team, and doing church missions, going to different countries to help perform dental work for the poor. She had even interned at a practice that helped poor children in Kentucky, so kids were a big part of her life through her whole life. She was always really interested in working with and helping children. One of her dental school classmates said of her, and I quote, "She was the most generous, giving friend. You could call her at 3 a.m. and she would answer without any hesitation. Her laugh was contagious, high-pitched, and full of joy." Her brother Neil also said of her, and I quote, "She was on a different level when it came to being awesome." Kendra was just a well-liked and popular girl. She was a respected and looked up to woman who made it her mission in life to helping children, both in her career and in her off time. She was an incredibly happy person with an infectious smile and laugh. You couldn't be in the same room with her and not smile. She was also physically beautiful with perfect teeth, high cheekbones, black hair, and green eyes. So the literal ideal for so many people. Kendra was incredibly loved, especially by her family, and of her family, especially by her nieces and nephews. They called her Aunt KK. And one of her nieces had even been at her house fairly recently before the murder took place, and she had been just staying there for a little while having a visit. And the two had had a ton of fun. They spent a bunch of time by the pool. They got their nails done. They just had a lot of quality time. And this niece even got to meet Kendra's new boyfriend, 38-year-old Ricky. She said Ricky was a really nice guy. He was a quiet guy, but friendly, that him and Kendra were very, very affectionate, very cuddly, very in love. And when he would be over while the niece was there, they would all watch movies together at night, and Ricky and Kendra would cuddle up on the couch and have no issue with PDA. Not like inappropriate PDA, but very cuddly, very kissy, very clearly feeling each other, liking each other, loving each other. Kendra and Ricky had met online only 4 months prior to her murder, and the date actually almost didn't happen because Kendra had had so many shitty online dates previously, but a friend of hers had convinced her to go, and in the end, she was glad that she had. Both Kendra and Ricky had been previously married, so the stakes felt a little higher dating now than maybe they would have at another point in their lives. The date had went well, and apparently Ricky had ordered chocolate chip pancakes for dinner, and this is something that Kendra found to be pretty funny, like that an adult man would order chocolate chip pancakes, but like, honestly, same. I would have done that, and I would have been attracted to a man who did that, yeah. From there, the relationship moved very quickly. I mean, they had just met 4 months prior, and Kendra was already thinking of giving up her life in Dallas and moving with Ricky to California because he had had a job offer. So they were pretty serious. They were even talking about marriage. They were already planning to start a wedding fund, even though they had just met and started dating. They were just super obsessed with each other. Ricky said that they just clicked, that they saw eye to eye on everything, that they were so into each other, that they met in the middle when it came to spiritual standpoints, professional standpoints, just everything about them just was a good fit. It just happened very quickly. During the 4 months that Kendra and Ricky were dating, she had actually written him a note, and I'm going to read the quote from that note now that illustrates how she felt about him. And that was, and I quote, "And then my soul saw you, and it kind of went, oh, there you are. I've been looking for you." So now, back to the day of the actual murder. Police start looking into Kendra now that they know her name, and this is when they learn that she has a very, very recent new boyfriend, a 38-year-old man named Ricky Pantagua, who was a dermatologist and white. And you remember, the kid that lived in the building said he saw a white man fleeing the scene. Well, you already knew about Ricky. Now the police knew about him too. So naturally, police wanted to speak to Ricky, and they were in the process of trying to locate him when he actually kind of came to them a little bit. So what happened was, it turns out Ricky had already been at Kendra's apartment at the Gables 17 apartment complex. He had been waiting inside her unit for her to get home from work because they had plans to hang out. He'd been waiting, he'd been waiting. He had gotten hungry, so he had actually left the apartment right before the murder took place. Okay. He went, he got some tacos, he came back, he tried to get into the building, and he was stopped where he met police, and they were like, oh, we would very much like to speak with you, guy. When police told Ricky what had happened to Kendra, he did seem genuinely shocked and distraught and hysterical. But regardless of that, police weren't really ready to write him off just yet because his story just seemed a little suspect, you know, that he just happened to be there, that he just happened to leave right before the murders, and that he just happened to come back right after the murders, and he was a white guy, and he was her love interest. They were like, we're not sure that we trust you, right? So then they move on, and they start talking to Kendra's family, to Kendra's friends, trying to see if there's anyone that anyone knew who may want to hurt her, but they came up with no leads because this woman was just universally loved by everyone who knew her. And meanwhile, while all of that is happening, police are also working with the apartment complex to try to get the camera footage, because there were cameras, like common area cameras, inside of the parking garage, to see if that could lead them to any more specific leads. To illustrate just how loved Kendra was, her coworkers ended up gathering outside of one of the entrances to the parking garage one of the evenings after her death to sort of have like a vigil for her. They held flowers and candles and posters with her face on them, and they told reporters that she was just a kind and wonderful person with a smile on her face permanently, and they could not imagine who would want to kill her. It was Kendra's sister who ended up having to call their mother and let her know what had happened, and apparently during that phone call, her sister called and all she said was, "Mom, it's Kendra." And immediately by her tone, she could tell that something had happened, and her mom started to cry right away. And that's when her sister told her that Kendra had been murdered, that she had been shot. And her mom just like lost it and ran out into the front yard and was like, no, 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 not my Kendra, and just started screaming. So during the investigation, police were able to get the footage from the parking garage, which was helpful for them. As they watched it, they did see that a black Jeep Cherokee was entering the apartment building at about 7:45 p.m., which is perfectly in line with what Hashim had said that he had seen. But where Hashim had only seen through the window and was only able to see one of the two people driving, police were able to get a better look at the people actually in the vehicle, and they saw the second person, and they realized that the person driving was a woman. From this footage, they were also able to see how the Jeep actually gained access to the parking garage, because remember I said it was like a gated community, so you would kind of need like to live there or to know somebody who lived there to have access. Well, what they saw is that the Jeep had actually been waiting outside the parking garage and waited until somebody who lived there had gone in, like used their clicker and went in to enter, and then they just followed behind them. Okay, so that opened up the possibility of it being somebody random because they didn't necessarily need a gate clicker to get in. On this video, they were also able to actually see the murder. It was very grainy. You couldn't see who the people were, but you see a black silhouette get out of the Jeep, go over, shoot Kendra, and then run back to the Jeep as the Jeep pulls out of a parking space. So quickly in the investigation, Dallas police realized that they were going to need help from the public to try to identify who the people in the Jeep were, who owned this Jeep. Some sort of clue to tie this Jeep to a person, because as they looked into Kendra and they looked into her life, it was producing no leads. This woman was just genuinely loved. There was no one who had anything bad to say, no one who knew her drove a Jeep. So the police actually held a press conference. During this press conference, they produced still images that were captured from the surveillance tapes, telling the public, like, hey, if you know whose car this is or who was driving it this day, please holla at your boy, because we don't know who this is. Which this does seem like a long shot, right? Like, it's a Jeep Cherokee. It's not a super unique car or anything. But somehow, this lead is helpful, and a man calls in, a man named Luis Ortiz, and he says, not only does he recognize the Jeep, but he believes that the Jeep belongs to him. Police bring Luis in for questioning, and immediately they are suspicious of him, obviously, because he's saying that he might own the car that was driving the murderer of Kendra Hatcher. So they look into him and they find that he is a mechanic and that he has no connection to Kendra whatsoever, And in his own words, he had no reason to hurt her. He didn't even know her. And on top of that, he actually did have an alibi for the time of the murder. He had been across town getting dinner with a friend. So they were like, okay, guy, if you didn't do it, how can you explain that your vehicle was at a murder scene if you weren't the one driving the vehicle? That is when Luis tells police that he had actually loaned his car to a friend, a 31-year-old woman named Brenda Delgado. Apparently what happened was, as I said, Luis was a mechanic. Brenda, who's a friend of his, was having issues with her car, brought it in to be serviced and was going to need a car in the meantime to drive whilst her car was being serviced. So he had loaned her his Jeep to drive while her car was being fixed. So that would make you think, okay, this Brenda woman, we want to talk to her. Here's the problem with that. Luis then tells them, but here's the thing, it couldn't be her either because I was having dinner with her across town. You know how he had an alibi that he was across town eating dinner? Well, he was eating dinner with Brenda Delgado, who was supposed to be in possession of his car. I know that that's confusing. This case has a lot of twists and turns and a lot of people. So maybe jot it down. So far we got Luis, we got Brenda, we got Ricky. All people you might want to remember. Or maybe you don't. I don't want to give anything away. So at that point, police, they put a pin in Luis. They by no means take him off the murder board. They just take him, put him over here, put a red piece of string. We'll deal with him later. And they decide they're going to now turn their focus to Brenda Delgado because obviously they need to speak to her now. They call her, ring, Brenda. Would you please come down for questioning? No problem. On my way. So she comes down for questioning. And they're like, listen, this is what Luis said. Your car was broken. He loaned you his Jeep. The Jeep was used in a murder, ... And she's like, I don't know what the fuck this guy's talking about. He must be having me confused with somebody else. 1, I was having dinner with him. 2, I wasn't using his Jeep. I think he's confusing me with our mutual friend, Crystal Cortez. Now, when I read that, I found it odd because I feel like if you loaned your car to someone, you may remember who you loaned the car to, especially since you know these people. You know Brenda, that's your friend that you're close enough with to have dinner. But this is what Brenda says. Brenda tells police that her and Crystal are newer friends, that they had only known each other about a month at this point, but that Crystal was kind of going through a rough patch in life. She was a single mother. She didn't have a lot of money, where Brenda was more successful in her life. So Brenda was kind of being there as like a friend, shoulder to cry on, a mentor, somebody to help her through these dark times, or so Crystal thought. So the police are like, okay, Brenda, can you please call your friend Crystal and ask her if she'll come down for questioning because we'd really like to speak to her now too. So she does that. Now Crystal comes down. So now they have all 3 of these people in the police station at the same time. They got Luis in one room, they got Brenda in one room, and now they've got Crystal in another room. So at this point, Luis and Brenda are just kind of chilling. Like they're in their rooms kind of waiting to see what happens with Crystal because they already have an alibi. They were together at dinner at the time of the murder. The only thing that was differing in their story was who had been loaned the Jeep. And when police were speaking to Crystal, they were finding that Crystal's story was lining more up with Brenda's. That Crystal said herself that the Jeep had been loaned to her and that the night of the murders, she was the one driving it, that she had been driving around with her 6-year-old son when something crazy had happened. This is what she told police. She said that she was out driving with her son when she thought to herself, you know, I'd really like to take this adorable sweet boy to the park. So they get over to the park and they realize that there's no street parking. There's nowhere for her to park. So knowing that this apartment building was nearby, she goes over, she waits, she sees somebody go in and she's like, free parking, hell yeah. Living in LA, I get that life. So she follows that car in, and while she's in there, all of a sudden, she hears gunshots, followed by a man running in front of her Jeep with a gun in one hand and a purse in the other. And that she then tried to speed away. Right away, police are like, hold that fucking thought. We know that that story's not true because we can see on camera that the person who shot Kendra jumped out of your vehicle. Okay, they jumped out of the Jeep. So can you maybe, I don't know, explain that? Because that doesn't make sense with your story. And that's when she changed her story completely. She said that she hadn't told the truth before because she was scared for her life. But now, I swear, I'm telling the truth. I'll take a polygraph, anything you want. This is the truth. So she says she was out driving around with her son when a man carjacked her, made her let him in the car, ordered her to drive him to this apartment complex, ordered her to drive to the back of the parking garage. He then jumped out of the car, committed the murder, bing, bang, boom, jumped back in the car, and made her drive him for a couple of blocks away from the building before jumping out of the car and fleeing out into the evening, never to be seen or heard from again. Police didn't really buy her story. She had already painted herself with her first lie as an uncredible liar, right? So they asked her, like, okay, why didn't you come forward sooner? And she was like, well, I hadn't seen anything on the news. And they're like, okay, but you know somebody was shot. You were there. And that's when she continued that she was just scared for her life and worried for the life of her son and didn't want anything to happen to her as well. So they kept her there and they questioned her at length, but still they weren't getting any information out of her. She just kept saying that this man was a stranger to her. She'd never met him before. She hadn't seen him since. But they just weren't really believing her story, so they kept pressing her and kept pressing her and kept pressing her. And that's when she changed her story again, and she changed it in a big, big ass way. Now, she wasn't carjacked. Her son wasn't even there that day. She was actually a willing participant in a robbery gone wrong. She said that her and a male friend had gone to this apartment complex because they were planning to rob a woman, that they came upon Kendra, that they went to simply rob her. They just wanted to steal her designer bag. And that Kendra just fought back and fought back, so her partner killed her. That was never the plan, but things just went horribly, horribly wrong. At this point, police were like, that story is also unbelievable, but we at least have you admitting to being part of the actual crime. So now, slap the cuffs on. Cuffs? Slap the cuffs on. Bitch, you're arrested for murder. And they arrested her. So now, police are very interested in finding her male friend who was with her at the time of the robbery, who presumably pulled the trigger. So they ask her, like, hey, can you tell us anything about him? She's like, oh, he was a tall, skinny black man with dreadlocks. Not at all what the teenager in the parking garage had seen, but okay, sure. Anything else? Oh, his name's Lamar. How do you know him? Where did you meet him? How long have you known him? Do you have any information on him? I got nothing. I literally have nothing. I know he drives a blue Sebring. I have his phone number. I can give you that. But that's literally it. And they're like, okay, can you sit with an artist to come up with a composite sketch so that maybe we can have an idea what this guy looks like? And she was like, absolutely, I can, and sat down and did that. At this point, local police are like, okay, we're going to need a little bit of backup. So they actually reach out to the FBI and see if the FBI would be willing to work with them and help trace this phone number and see what they could find. So they do. FBI traces the phone number to an apartment, and the police drive over to this apartment, and they're surprised to see a blue Chrysler Sebring sitting in the parking lot. So they're like, okay, we're definitely in the right spot. So they sit on it, and they sit on it, and they wait on it, and they wait until finally a man who matched the description that Crystal had given to police came out and walked towards the car. So police quickly roll up on him, and they're like, hey, this your car? You going somewhere? How about instead of that, you come with us and we will question you about your involvement in a murder. And he was like, absolutely, I will. He was cool as a cucumber, and he got in the car and he went with them. So now police are sitting across from the man that they believe could be responsible for shooting Kendra. And this man's name was Christopher Love, not Lamar, like Crystal had said. His name was Christopher Love, and he was keeping his cool. They questioned him at length, and he denied everything. He denied knowing Crystal. He denied being involved with the murder. He just denied. And while they were questioning him, they actually had his car at the police impound lot. They had brought it in. They searched the car. They searched his apartment, and they found nothing useful. They didn't find the gun. They found nothing. So they were like, we literally have nothing on this guy. Now, this is when something really cool happens. So it really seems like with this case, so many puzzle pieces just fit together so perfectly for them to actually solve this murder. It's amazing. It's really cool to see. So at the same time, they have Christopher Love in the interrogation room speaking with police. There is another guy, like a detective with a drug sniffing dog. Like the guy's name is, I don't know, but I know that the dog's name was Titan because I take note of the important things. And Titan and Titan's dad had been at the impound lot, and they were doing a demonstration to show what Titan could do. Titan was able to sniff the items that would make like a bomb and also gunpowder. So he does his demonstration. Titan finds what he needs to find. They're all amazed. They're like, oh my God, this dog is amazing. Titan is clearly the goodest of all the boys. So once this guy had finished his demonstration with Titan, the investigators that were working on Kendra's case came up to him and they were like, hey, before you leave, I know you're not normally here, so we have this warrant to search this car, right? We're looking for a gun. They let him know what they're looking for. They let him know the whole case. And they're like, would you mind just letting Titan go on over, do his little thing, and just confirm that we didn't miss anything? And the guy's like, sure, no problem. So he takes Titan over to the car. Titan does his thing. He does his sniffing, and all of a sudden he sits down, letting his dad know that he has found something. Once he's done with that, the guy, you know, they don't search the car immediately. Like, well, they kind of do, but the guy's not going to wait around for the search to finish. He's got some stuff to do. Titan's got other important work that needs to be done that day. So they're on their way out. As they're leaving, the people start searching the car. The investigators start searching the car in the area that Titan had indicated, which was down near the ashtray area, so real low in the car. And all of a sudden, Titan and his dad are walking. When they hear a guy running up behind him, they turn and the guy's like, we just wanted to let you know, Titan was right. We found a gun. So what had happened was they started digging deep down under the dashboard in an area that they hadn't searched before, and that's when they came across a gun that they had missed in their first search. It was a .40 caliber semi-automatic handgun, and later it would be determined that this gun was the one used to murder Kendra. So police bring in this gun and they show it to Christopher Love and are like, so guess what? We found this hidden in your car, bud. Have you ever seen it before? And he was like, yeah, you know, actually, yes, I have seen that gun. And actually, that's Crystal's gun. The woman who just a moment ago, he claimed he didn't know at all. And he's like, and actually, I didn't shoot the gun. I have the gun because I'm holding the gun, but Crystal's the one who shot the gun. Crystal's the one who committed the murder. And they were like, cool story, bro. Slap the cuffs on him as well. Cuffs? Did I say it again? Slap the cuffs on him as well. And he too was arrested for Kendra's murder. So now we have Crystal Cortez arrested for Kendra's murder, and we have Christopher Love arrested for Kendra's murder. So at this point, they had let Brenda and Luis go because they have these two people in custody. But as police look into the backgrounds of both Crystal and Christopher, they start to think that there's a good chance that these people didn't look alone. Neither of them had any connection to Kendra, and this looked like a very deliberate, planned, specific hit on Kendra Hatcher. So it would need to be somebody who knew her. So they were now thinking that maybe Christopher and Crystal were hired by somebody. So they decide that they want to take a closer look at Kendra's new boyfriend, Ricky. Quiet, sweet, cuddly, affectionate Ricky. Ricky had seemed to be genuinely upset when he found out that Kendra was murdered, but it's always the husband, right? And it wasn't just police that suspected Ricky either. Kendra's brother Neil had actually suspected Ricky from day one and had even called him and sort of threatened him a bit the day that Kendra was killed. Police bring Ricky in to be questioned, and right away, they feel like they might be on the right track. Ricky is, less helpful than they'd hope or expect a grieving boyfriend to be, and he even, refused to give police his cell phone so that they could search it for evidence. Ricky told police that, he wanted to be helpful, but that he believed that he should talk to an attorney and get some legal advice before he spoke to them or gave them any of his electronics, which honestly is the right call. Truly, that's what I always say to everyone. If you are ever arrested for anything, even if you're innocent, especially if you're innocent, get an attorney. It's the smartest thing that you can do, right? Innocent people go to jail all the time. However, it definitely never makes you look good to do that. So it is a double-edged sword. So police told Ricky, that's fine. You want to get your legal advice? Get your legal advice. In the meantime, we're going to get a warrant and we're going to go through all your shit. We're just going to search your whole house. We're going to search your whole life. And he's like, what? Am I a suspect? Am I a suspect? Is that why you're doing this? And they were like, no one said you were a suspect. We don't need you to be a suspect for us to get a warrant to go through your shit. You are connected to this woman. You could have a connection to the murder. We can and will get a warrant and search your shit. And that's when Ricky sort of panicked and he just agreed to give them his cell phone. So now, Ricky's released. He's at home that night and he's sitting there and he's watching TV when the news comes on. When the news comes on, it's talking about Kendra's story, which must be fucking heartbreaking to sit and watch the story of the woman you loved being murdered on the news. As he continues watching, though, he sees the still images from the surveillance camera of the parking garage. And as he watches it and he sees these still images of the people police are looking for, he feels sick to his stomach because someone in this photo looks familiar to him. It actually looks like an ex-girlfriend of his. An ex-girlfriend who he had actually spoken to the day Kendra was murdered, an ex-girlfriend who had offered her condolences and had offered to bring over groceries or anything he may need. So he's like, this is fucking crazy. So he contacts police and he's like, listen, I just saw the news. I have an idea who the woman in the still images is. I think that's my ex-girlfriend, Brenda Delgado. Did you just get chills? Because I just got chills. And I know the story and I just got chills. Now, who was Brenda Delgado? Brenda was the child of parents who had immigrated to the U.S. from Mexico. So when Brenda was a child, her family did the best they could to provide for her and her 4 brothers in Dallas, Texas, but they had little money. Her father worked as a construction worker and her mother worked for the USPS and also cleaned houses. But with 5 kids, it just wasn't a lot of money, so they grew up mostly poor. Because of this, Brenda was determined to make more out of her life in the States, to make her parents proud, to do better than they had, every parent's dream, you know? So she was a really good student. Her teachers loved her, and in school, she even took a part-time job as a florist and a waitress to help out her family. When she was older, she still had this drive to make the best out of herself and her whole situation. So she was actually in school to be a dental hygienist at the time of Kendra's murder. Brenda and Ricky had been pretty serious. They had been together for over 2 years, living together after only 3 months of dating, and he had given her a promise ring. So it kind of seems to me like Ricky is like a fast mover in relationships just in general, but that could just be me. At one point, the two had even become pregnant, but they ended up having an abortion. Brenda was under the impression that she and Ricky were going to get married, so you can imagine how devastating it was when he called the whole thing off. Why he ended it is uncertain, but it devastated Brenda, who was just super in love with him. After the breakup, her grades dropped in school, and she took a few weeks off from her dental hygiene program and just needed some her time because there was a lot going on. The two did end up reconnecting and getting back together for a short while after Brenda randomly showed up at this salsa dancing class that Ricky happened to be taking. What a coinkydink that she found herself there. But the two ran into each other, they started talking, they started dating again. She still kept her own place at that point, but they were like, you know, hanging out, dating. And it didn't last though. He ended up again breaking it off in February of 2015, and from that time on, the two had remained platonic friends. He was like, we can still talk, we text, we're buds. You can stay on my cell phone plan, like we're cool, but we're not dating anymore. And that was already hard for her, obviously, because she still wanted to be with him. But then, just a little while after that, he already had a new girlfriend, Kendra Hatcher. So, that definitely reopened a pre-existing wound for Brenda Delgado. At this point, police really want to try to connect Brenda to this crime, but the problem is she had an alibi. Remember, she was across town having dinner with Luis, and she had even produced a receipt that showed that she was, in fact, there. So, it's just really odd to them, considering she's clearly involved, right? Like, how else would that name just randomly be pulled out of Ricky's ass if she wasn't involved? And on top of that, Luis had said that he loaned the Jeep to Brenda, not Crystal, so it just wasn't adding up right. So they're like, okay, let's try to connect her in another way. So they go to Christopher Love, and they're like, hey, bud, how long have you known Brenda? How do you know Brenda? And he's like, Brenda? Who's Brenda? And he, you know, he does the whole, I don't know who that is, blah, blah, blah. They go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth before finally he's like, fine, I do know Brenda. Not personally, like we don't know each other well, but we do know each other professionally because we did make a recent business transaction. Christopher Love said that Brenda had hired him to rob Kendra, not kill her, just to steal Kendra's purse. Brenda had told Christopher that she was a, quote, cocaine cowgirl, which is apparently a member of the Mexican drug cartel, and she told him that if he helped her do this, he would get a big payout and be able to be put into contact with people who could further his drug dealing career, which is what his goals were. He was a very goal-oriented guy. He saw something, and he went for it, you know? Police now go back to Brenda with everything they have. They tell her everything Christopher Love said. They tell her everything Ricky said, and they like start questioning her and trying to get under her skin. They're like, so, did it like hurt a lot when he left you? Did it make you feel inadequate? Did it make you wonder what she had that you didn't? Did it make you hate Kendra, that he chose her over you, etc., etc.? And Brenda was like sticking to her gun. She's like, listen, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. You must have me confused with Crystal. She just keeps throwing this poor girl, Crystal, right under the bus, just 24/7. Not me, it's Crystal. Not me, it's Crystal. So they go to Crystal. They tell Crystal, like, hey, your homegirl, she's throwing you under the bus left and right. We gotta politely let that ambulance go through real quick. She's throwing you under the bus left and right, so you might want to talk. And this is when Crystal gets pissed and she's like, you know what? Yes, I will talk. Loyalty, who is she? And she tells them everything. She admitted to police that, like Christopher Love, Brenda had hired her to take part in murdering Kendra Hatcher. Here's the problem. They have no direct evidence connecting Brenda to the murder. They just have two people with their feet to the fire, quite literally, well, figuratively, that are both in jail for murder, whose testimony and admissions don't hold a lot of weight without proof because these people are trying to get out of a murder charge. So even though police believe Brenda was involved, Ricky believed that Brenda was involved, and two people who were arrested for the murder said that Brenda was involved, they had no proof and they had to let her go. Within a day or two of being released from that interview room, Brenda Delgado was in the wind. She had fled the country. Brenda Delgado was formally indicted for murder 7 weeks after the murder of Kendra Hatcher and was considered to be a fugitive on the run, wanted for capital murder. The news broadcasted the information that Brenda had, in fact, hired Christopher Love to murder Kendra Hatcher. Police did their best to search for Brenda. They talked to her friends, her family, and at first her family was in shock. They didn't believe that Brenda was capable of planning out that sort of crime, or any crime for that matter. Brenda's mother said of this, and I quote, "She's a beautiful and very Christian person. She has the best family values and is not the jealous type at all." Brenda was in the wind, but eventually police did learn from Brenda's father that Brenda had gotten on a bus and had fled to Mexico. But where in Mexico was beyond him because they had a lot of family out there. She could literally be anywhere in the country. So police are searching for her. They are looking everywhere for her. They believe that her family has been wiring her money from the States, so they're kind of following that money. And they're finding that, sir, excuse him, excuse you. Police were finding that they were always just like one step behind Brenda, man. Every time they would show up at a place, it's like she had just been there, but they just kept missing her. So after 7 months of searching for her, but being unsuccessful in finding her, Brenda actually ended up being added to the FBI's top 10 most wanted list, and she was only the 9th woman to ever actually be added to that list, which I found interesting. And with being added to that list, the FBI also released to the public that if you were to see her, don't approach her. Let us know, but don't approach her because she could be armed and dangerous. They considered her as such. But they definitely still wanted people to call in, and they even offered a $100,000 reward for any information that could lead to her capture. In addition to that, police back in Texas were putting some pressure on Brenda's family. They were already in the process of drawing up paperwork to have certain members of her family arrested for aiding and abetting. And her family was working with an attorney to try to figure out their best options. And this attorney was also corresponding with Brenda to try to come up with the terms of her peaceful surrender. So apparently Brenda was planning on coming back on her own. They were going to make a deal that would keep her family out of jail, and she'd come back to Texas, be arrested, and everything would be put with a nice little tight little bow. But police had little faith that Brenda would actually show back up. While this was happening, though, police actually got lucky when a tip came in that seemed promising that Brenda was in a specific place in Mexico. So the police went. They went to the place, and guess what? She was there, and they arrested her. And I guess the attorney who was working on her peaceful surrender was kind of pissed off about this because they were like, we were working on a deal, but they got lucky, they got the tip, they went in and they got her. And I guess when this was happening, Kendra's brother Neil had been on a plane, so he didn't learn about the news until the plane landed. But when the plane landed, he was so overcome with emotion and so happy that an arrest had been made that he just grabbed the person next to him and started to hug this person. I guess it was whatever lady was next to him, either on the plane or at the airport. I can't remember if he was off the plane yet, probably still on the plane. And I really wonder what was going through this woman's head, because I don't know how I would deal with a stranger just grabbing me and likely sobbing and hugging me. Now, the issue police were running into now that Brenda was arrested is that she was arrested in Mexico. So now they had to work with Mexico. Texas, Mexico had to work together to come to the terms of her being extradited from Mexico back to Texas. Now, Mexico would not send her back to Texas unless the death penalty was taken off the table. Apparently that's a thing, because I think she was a citizen of both Mexico and the U.S., and in that case, they will not have one of their citizens executed on our land, I think. So the prosecution's like, fine, we will take the death penalty off the table. Just send the bitch back so that we can try her. So after 6 months of sitting in a jail in Mexico, she was sent back to Texas to pay for her crimes. So the prosecution's main objective was getting the harshest punishment possible for Christopher Love and Brenda Delgado, because Brenda Delgado was the mastermind, Christopher Love, the trigger man. So they started to kind of push on Crystal, who had the least involvement in the crime, the least serious involvement in the crime. So they go to her and they're like, hey, do you want to make a deal? Because right now, you could die. You could be executed for the part that you took in this murder. So do you want to make a deal where you would testify against both Brenda and Christopher, and in exchange the death penalty would be taken off the table? Is that something you're interested in? And at first she was resistant, so they let her just sit with it. They let it stew with her. She had a 6-year-old son. They let her kind of like think about the fact that she could be executed for this. And eventually she did agree that she would testify against both Brenda and Christopher, and she made this decision just weeks before Christopher's trial was to begin. At Christopher's trial, the prosecutor told the jury that Brenda Delgado had approached Christopher Love and offered him money, drugs, and connections in exchange for murdering Kendra Hatcher. Crystal ended up taking the stand as the prosecution's star witness, and she told the court and the jury what happened that day. Crystal told the jury that, she drove Christopher over to the parking garage that day, that he got out of the car, that she heard Kendra crying out and begging for help as he approached her with the gun. She cried out, no, 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 help me, before hearing the gunshots. It's just messed up. And if Crystal's testimony wasn't bad enough, they also had a recorded jailhouse phone call between Christopher and his girlfriend. I don't know why these people don't realize that all of these phone calls are recorded, but he was talking to his girlfriend on the phone, and she's like, why did you have that gun on you? Why hadn't you gotten rid of it? Why would you still have that? And he was just like, I know I should have, but it's too late now. After 3 hours of deliberation, Christopher Love was found guilty of the murder of Kendra Hatcher, and he was given the death penalty. Christopher's father apologized to Kendra's family during the trial, saying, and I quote, "I'm so sorry to the family back there. I'm so sorry, y'all." Next was Brenda's trial, and hers was going to be a lot more difficult because all of the evidence against her was circumstantial, and she had an alibi for the time of the murder. On top of that, Brenda was a well-liked student studying to be a dental hygienist with no criminal record, and she barely knew Crystal and Christopher. So to get a jury to believe that she was able to convince these two people that she barely knew to commit a murder for her was gonna be a tough sell. Brenda's trial started in June of 2019, and the prosecution told the jury a tale of obsession. An obsession that Brenda had for her ex-boyfriend, the man she thought she would marry, Ricky, and during the whole trial, she had trouble keeping her eyes off him. He ended up testifying against her at her trial and told the court all about their relationship, about how it was when they were together, about them breaking up, and then after them breaking up, she would always sort of show up at random places that he was, like at his salsa dance class or on his running path, and at the time, he didn't think much of it, but in hindsight, he was thinking a lot of it, and that the two would get back together, but that when they broke up the last time, it was for good, and then he met Kendra. He also told them how the two had stayed friends, though, that they talked often, that she was still on his phone plan, and they even confided in her about, like, the status of his relationship. It did come out at trial, though, that it wasn't a coincidence that Brenda was showing up at these places that Ricky was, because she had been stalking him for a while. She had been stalking his location on his phone through the Find My iPhone app, because they were on the same phone plan, so she could do that. And she had also been stalking his and Kendra's social media. She had photos of just him and photos of him and Kendra together saved to her phone. And what's really creepy is it came out at trial that she actually had been letting herself in to his apartment whenever he wasn't there to just like be in there and learn information and just be a total fucking creep. Things came to a head between Ricky and Brenda, and when things were really put into motion on August 31st, 2015, when Ricky reached out to Brenda and was like, listen, I have a new girlfriend. As you know, things are going well. Things are getting pretty serious, so I need us, you and I, to have a more substantial split. I need you to come to my place and get the rest of your stuff. I'm going to take you off my phone plan. We need this to just be more separate. And that was just 2 days before Kendra was murdered. Luis also testified against Brenda at her trial, and he did not make her look good. He said that, yeah, they had gone out to dinner. That was true, but that he had loaned his Jeep to Brenda, not Crystal. And that when he had first seen his vehicle on the news, he had actually called Brenda prior to calling police. And when he spoke to her that day, she asked him to help her cover up for a crime. She said not to do anything, to hide it, to not tell anybody what happened, not tell anybody what he had seen, and that she would pay for him to get a new paint job on his Jeep to hide that it was the black Jeep used in the crime. And he was just kind of like, no, I won't be doing that, and called the police instead. It also came out at trial that Brenda had reached out to others about getting a gun or finding someone that she could hire to, quote, hurt someone. She had even tried to hire her own cousin to attack Kendra with a baseball bat. She had also told her friend that she wanted Ricky to be beaten into a coma with the bat and Kendra to be killed. She told so many people what she was planning and had tried to get so many people to help her commit this crime, yet no one called the police. No one did anything. And if they had, Kendra may be alive today. This is that see something, say something. This is when you should have said something. It's none of these people's fault directly, but like you should say something. So if your friend's telling you that they're trying to find somebody to murder their ex-boyfriend's new girlfriend, tell somebody. Just tell somebody, man. Come on. Talk to your friend. Tell them they're being a dumb bitch, but also tell somebody. Then Crystal Cortez took the stand, and she had made a deal with the prosecution that the death penalty would be taken off the table if she testified in court against Brenda and told the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Otherwise, the deal would be off. She told she told the court at that point that this was always intended to be a hit against Kendra. It wasn't supposed to be a robbery gone wrong. She had hired them to murder Kendra because she was so jealous of Ricky's new relationship. And she even told the court of all the different ways that she and Brenda had sat down together and had planned to commit this murder. She said of the different ways that they had considered killing Kendra, and I quote, "One was to inject her with heroin. Another was to inject her with a sedative. And the other was to kill her with a gun." Initially, Crystal had actually agreed to be the trigger man, to be the person to actually go out and murder Kendra, but after the two sat and talked for a while, they realized that they needed somebody else to do the dirty work. Crystal said of this, quote, "She asked me if I knew someone could do it, because I came from a rundown neighborhood." Within no time, Christopher Love had fallen into their lap. They had been over at Crystal's mother's house when they ran into him. He had been there with his kids. They were playing, and they had sort of taken him aside and been like, "So, question. Do you personally, or do you know anybody that kills people?" And he was like, "Oh my God, so funny you asked. I actually do murder people. That's something that is on my resume." And they were like, "Great, let's do business." While things were in motion, Crystal and Brenda had been stalking Kendra. They had been following her around to learn her routine, to learn different ways to get into her parking garage. They had been watching her through night vision binoculars. They had even attempted to get a silencer for the gun that Christopher Love had bought to actually commit the murder, but they decided against it. And it was while during all their recon that Brenda had sort of been pushed into a corner. She had gone through Ricky's phone, and she had seen that Kendra and Ricky were about to go away for the Labor Day weekend, and that once they got back, they were going to be going to visit Kendra's family so that Ricky could meet them for the first time because they were getting so serious. So she felt like she was out of time, and now was the time to do it. They then set their plan in motion. They headed to Luis's shop so that they could drop off their car and get the Jeep. Crystal agreed to drive that day because Christopher wasn't very familiar with Dallas, and she was. The two then, Christopher and Crystal, then drove and dropped Brenda off at a library so that she could use studying for school as part of her alibi, and she could be seen there. And then they headed to Kendra's work to wait for her to get off for that day. Once she got off, they started to follow her home, but they lost her on the way. So Brenda, knowing the area, not Brenda, Crystal, knowing the area well, drove real fast in another route and ended up getting to the apartment complex before Kendra did. She waited, she pulled in, and Christopher hid in the back of the Jeep and waited for Kendra to come home. Once Kendra arrived, Christopher got out of the car, he went over and he murdered Kendra, and then he got back in and they left. They went straight back to Luis's garage where they met up with Brenda, and they are seen on surveillance there looking at Kendra's stolen purse. And the footage is really grainy, it's hard to see, so Crystal had to point out to the court who was who in the video. The next day, Brenda paid off Christopher with the combination of cash and cocaine, and then she gave Crystal a whopping $500 for her part in the crime. Crystal is a crazy person, I guess, just like off a rocker, and she took the money and made it into a shape of a heart and then took a photo of it, which they found that she had like posted online, and then she took a selfie with her good friend Brenda because they are gross. Brenda was asked why she would take such a small amount of money to do something so fucking terrible, and she said, quote, "I was broke. I have a son to support." Brenda's defense did the best that they could to try to get her a non-guilty verdict, and I think they did a good job because they just basically said, like, your only evidence against our client is the testimony of a convicted murderer, Christopher Love, and an admitted liar, Crystal Cortez. This woman has lied every step of the way. She lied every time you asked her any questions. She lied. She just lies, and she is lying now to get a deal. And the only evidence you have that ties my client to this crime is from these two people who are not credible witnesses at all. They said that it was just Crystal and Christopher who wanted to commit this crime, that they were intending to simply rob Kendra, and that it was a robbery gone wrong, and that it was just them. And that any connection that Brenda had to these two was just a coincidence, and Brenda Delgado did not testify at her trial. The jury was sent to deliberate, and after less than 20 minutes, they came back with a verdict. Isn't that insane? I don't think I've ever heard of that happening. And on a circumstantial case, albeit a strong circumstantial case, but just a circumstantial case, in less than 20 minutes, they came back with a verdict. And as the verdict was read, Kendra's family stood and held each other and braced themselves for whatever they were about to hear. Quote, "We, the jury, unanimously find the defendant guilty of capital murder as charged in the indictment. Brenda Delgado was given the maximum allowable sentence with the death penalty being taken off the table, and that was life in prison without the possibility of parole." Kendra's mother said to Brenda Delgado in her victim impact statement, a pretty powerful statement, and that was, and I quote, "You, Brenda Delgado, have earned your spot on this earth behind cold steel bars for the rest of your miserable, pathetic life. And if justice could have handed you a death sentence, make no mistake, I would have been there, front and center." Crystal Cortez was given a sentence of 35 years for her involvement in the crime, and she would be eligible for parole after serving just half of her sentence. And Kendra's brother Neil said to Crystal in his victim impact statement, and I quote, "I think what you did was incredibly stupid. I do want to tell you that I appreciate your testimony. I can't say I forgive you, but maybe over time it's something that I could do." Brenda Delgado did already, even though this just happened, this was like, a little over 2 years ago, Brenda did already try to appeal her conviction, bringing up 11 different points in her appeal where she thought that she deserved a second chance, but the Dallas upheld her conviction, so. I now want to wrap up this video and end it with a quote from Kendra's mother, Bonnie, to Brenda Delgado about her daughter, Kendra Hatcher, and she said, and I quote, "Brenda Delgado, justice has been served for the people whose lives were touched in one way or another by this incredible, amazing woman, which I was honored to be, Kendra Hatcher's mother. You, Brenda Delgado, are the root of all evil. You and the other two pathetic lives you had join you on your path of destruction. In the little bit of time I've learned about you these past 5 days, you could never have measured up to be the woman that my daughter, Kendra Hatcher, was." And with that quote, that, my friends, is the story of the murder of Kendra Hatcher. Isn't that just so messed up, dude? It breaks my heart. Kendra seemed like she was just such an awesome person who was killed for literally no reason. Like, no one had a bad thing to say about her at all, and she was so selfless in everything she did. She was like all about the kids. She just sounds like such a good person, and she got wrapped up in something that's so stupid, man, to kill somebody for that reason. Like, her and Ricky though it was getting serious, they had just started dating. And I'm not trying to like downplay the relationship because it does seem like they loved each other. But it's like she was murdered over a guy that she'd known for 4 months. She was literally murdered over a brand new boyfriend. And the fact that this Brenda could get so jealous that she would have somebody murdered for a guy is just beyond me. It like blows my mind when people do things like that. There are so many people out there. There are so many people out there. Don't kill people. Just don't kill people. There you go. End. On this day of love, happy Valentine's Day. Don't kill people. But anyways, guys, that completes this video. I hope you found it interesting and informative, and it gave you all the details you would want when looking into this case. And of course, I want to thank you for taking the time to remember Kendra with me today. She was a serious loss to all of those who loved her. To listen to her mother talk, to watch her mother and see her face when she's testifying against, not testifying against, when she's talking about her daughter, will rip your heart into a million pieces. You can feel this woman's pain. And it's just very clear that she was incredibly loved and that her absence is very heavy and present on all of those who cared about her. And I can't even imagine what that's like. And that's so messed up. Now, with all of that said, come gather around and let me tell you the story of the murder of 38-year-old Robert Lamone. I want to start this case with giving you a quote from Robert Lamone's wife. This is to kind of illustrate who it is that we're dealing with here, who the players are, who was lost in all of this. And this is a post that she put online after learning about her husband's tragic murder. She said, and I quote, "Robert showed his love, compassion, hardworking skills, and genuine kindness to everyone he met. I will never let Rob's love die or fade out. I will carry it with me wherever I go and remind our children of it daily as they grow." Robert and Sabrina Lamone were a typical married couple living in Silver Lakes, California. They were kind, they were affectionate with each other, they had 2 children, they had pet names for each other, they called each other Bear and Pooter, and they were just known as being very, very affectionate, very loving, very big on the PDA, and just an all-around good, solid, loving couple. The 2 were known for never fighting and always smiling. Having this perfect relationship with Sabrina was very important to Robert throughout his life. You see, when he was younger, his parents had gotten a divorce, and it had been incredibly hard on him. He watched his family, like the idea he had of his perfect family, just get wrecked right before his eyes, and he spent a lot of time actually being raised by his older sister. And seeing this happen to his family really like put something in his brain that made him feel like this is something he definitely didn't want. So later in life, when he was married, he was determined to make sure that his relationship was strong, that it lasted, and that he had, you know, the perfect relationship, the most perfect relationship he could have with his future wife. Robert was known as just being a super nice guy. He was known as being the guy who made friends with anyone and everyone he met. Anywhere he went, he made friends there. He never had a single problem with anybody. He was the type of person that if you ever needed help with anything, like no matter what time of day it is, you call Robert, he's going to be there to help you. It doesn't matter. That was just in his character. And he was also known as, on top of being like really nice and kind and helpful, he was also really funny and a really good time. So he's the perfect friend to have in your life because you can have a good time, but he was also reliable. And I find that sometimes you can't find all that in one person. Straight out of high school, Robert moved to Arizona to live with his older sister, Chris. And it was there, in the state of deserts, that he met his future love of his life, Sabrina. He was 21 and she was 18. And as soon as the 2 got together, Robert was all in. He was head over heels in love. He brought Sabrina home to meet his sister, and he told his sister, like, "Bro, I think I'm gonna marry this girl." And his sister, Chris, could tell that he was serious from day one. There was something different about this one. The 2 seemed totally in love, not just with each other, but also with each other's families. And they quickly moved in together and began planning their future. On August 19th of the year 2000, the 2 decided they were going to get married. Well, they didn't decide. They were going to get married on that day, and they got married on that day. That's when they decided. It's not when they decided, but it's when they did. Bring the law into this. So the 2 were married in a nice, cute little church wedding. And they were stoked. They were in love. They were married. They were getting their future going. Robert had considered, he like toyed with the idea of becoming a firefighter, but he decided instead to get a job for the railroad. And he like loved his job. He was the type of guy who put 100% of his effort into everything he did, and this job was no different. Worked super hard. He always had fun at work, and he was always like taking selfies with passing trains and just making the best out of every day that he was alive. Eventually, the couple decided that they wanted to settle down, make a life for themselves, and get a home, and they did so in a place called Silver Lakes that was located in Helendale, California, a place that's referred to by some as the happiest place in the high desert, which I have to say, I don't think I would agree. I mean, I haven't been back for many years, probably 12 years, but for me, I've always associated that place with like a lot of pain and trauma, personally. If you've never been there, it's literally in the middle of nowhere. You would just be driving down Route 66. From my direction, I'd be driving down Route 66 for miles and miles and miles into the desert. All of a sudden, on my left, there'd be a splash of land with some houses and stuff, the really, really tiny little town. And before I realized what I was looking at, I would have already passed it, and I would just be going, and I would just be gone. I was there a ton as a teenager. Like, that's where me and my friends, like, I had friends who still lived there, and me and my best friend who no longer lived there, she never lived there, I no longer lived there. We would drive out there almost every weekend, and we would sleep wherever, outside, inside, kind of just depended on what we could do. And there's just like not a lot to do out there, I can tell you that now. All the teenagers ever did that lived there was get into trouble and leave that town to go to closer nearby towns to actually have anything to do. The couple bought a home on a street called Strawberry Lane. How adorable. And it was right next to one of the man-made man-made lakes that are in Silver Lakes. The two went on to have 2 children. They had a son named Robbie and then a daughter named Leanne. And they acclimated well to living in Silver Lakes. They were very friendly and they were very personable. So they made a lot of friends very quickly. And of these friends was another couple, a couple named Kelly and Jason. So Kelly was a hairdresser, and that's actually how she and Sabrina met, because Sabrina had gone to her salon to get her hair done. And once the two met, they really hit it off. So from there, they introduced their husbands to each other, Jason and Rob. And Jason was a firefighter. So this must have been interesting to Rob, considering he had considered being a firefighter. That was one of the professions he had kind of toyed with before ending up working for the railroad. So from there, the group became inseparable. These were like the best friends. They did everything together. They did all the birthdays, all the holidays. They would get together and have like barbecues in the yard and just be like BFFs. And it was them, and then like those 2 couples, and then they were friends with a bunch of other couples, but none were as close as like Sabrina and Rob and Kelly and Jason. Those were like the close ones, but there were a bunch of other couples that got together as well. And this like group, this like crew of adults referred to themselves as the Wolf Pack. I don't know why I was so judgy about that, because like I wouldn't say I'm in a wolf pack at all, but it's a group of 3 couples, my best friends. We just all happen to like, it doesn't matter. This doesn't matter. The end. To get back to the story a little bit and to illustrate what a good guy Rob was considered in the wolf pack, Rob was the guy that all of the guys wanted to be like, and all of the women wanted their husbands to be like. Like Rob would do something super sweet because he was just like a sweet guy, and all the women would be like to their husbands like, what the fuck, why can't you be more like Rob? And the guys were just like, fucking Rob, stop making us look bad. But he was just such a good guy that naturally he just made the other guys around him look less than. On August 11th, 2014, Robert Limon celebrated his 38th birthday, and a week later, he was murdered. On August 17th, 2004, Rob was working the day shift about an hour and a half away from his home at a railroad station in Tehachapi, California. At the same time, Sabrina was working a shift at a Costco nearby the couple's home. Once her shift was over, she texted her husband, but received no response, which was odd considering the couple pretty much texted on and off all day. But for some reason today, he wasn't responding. She texted him a couple hours later, a little after 8 p.m., when he had not texted her that he was off work and heading home. And again, there was just radio silence. While all of this was happening, while Sabrina was texting her husband waiting to get a response and not getting a response, another man, a co-worker who was headed to the railroad site to relieve Robert, to be like the next shift to relieve Robert from his duties, arrived at the location just before 7 p.m. He liked to get there a little bit early and like talk to whoever had been working the night before and kind of see what was going on, if there's anything he should know. So he gets there and he finds that the shop's totally closed up, which is weird. It's not something you would do, and it's not something Robert would do specifically. So he goes in, and as soon as he enters the warehouse, he sees that Robert's truck is inside, but Robert is nowhere to be found. So he immediately gets a really bad feeling because it just felt wrong. And as he searched a little farther, his bad feeling was confirmed to be, what's the word? Relevant, appropriate. English is hard. It didn't take this coworker long to realize that his feelings of being uneasy were valid when he stumbled across Robert's body. He was laying on the ground face up with a wound to his head. He had been shot to death. This coworker immediately called 911, and as soon as he did, the dispatcher talked him through how to do CPR on Rob to, attempt to save his life. But as soon as he started, blood started to come out of Rob's mouth. And when the man told the dispatcher this, she was like, okay, listen, she or he, I don't know, was like, listen, stop, go outside, wait for officers to arrive. So he did just that. And once officers did arrive, Rob was pronounced dead on the scene. News of Rob's murder quickly spread through the small town of Silver Lakes because, as I said, this is a very small town. And as soon as the information got to Kelly, Sabrina's really good friend, she immediately rushed over to the house to be with Sabrina. And when she arrived, Sabrina and the couple's daughter, Leanne, were walking around the house, both wearing railroad jackets since that was, Robert's job, and holding a picture of him and just sobbing, which is just really sad to think about. That poor kid, man. I can't even imagine. That poor, it's just a lot. Sabrina's sister was also there. She had gone to be with her sister in her time of need and actually stayed there for a couple of days, and each night laid with her sister Sabrina and just rubbed her back and tried to do anything she could to make her feel like things were going to be okay. But obviously, man, nothing's ever okay after something like that. Meanwhile, while all of that's going on at the house, police are investigating the crime scene and trying to find out what happened. And they discover that 38-year-old Robert had been shot twice. He had been shot while facing his killer, once in the chest and once in the chin. A computer had been stolen from the warehouse, and the warehouse was totally ransacked. Drawers were open. Everything was thrown out all over the floor. So it looked like a burglary, but police were immediately suspicious of this because they're like, a burglary way out here? What are the odds of that? This is out in the middle of nowhere, and these places aren't exactly known for having a lot of money or valuables on site. So why would somebody target this place as a robbery, right? And on top of that, Robert's wallet was still on his person. So they were like, that doesn't seem to be consistent with a robbery. And on top of that, they found that there were no shell casings on the ground. And generally speaking, if it's a random burglary, you tend to find those on the ground. When you don't find those on the ground, it's because somebody who may know the person and may be linked to the person has killed the person. So it's personal, so they pick up the casings to not be traced. So now police are operating under the idea that somebody was there to kill Rob specifically. But when they talked to his wife, his coworkers, his friends, police were again stumped. No one had a bad thing to say about Rob. They said he was a stand-up guy, a good friend, someone you could count on for literally anything, and no one that anyone knew had any issues with him. He was a loving husband, a wonderful father, and there were no known skeletons in his closet. He and his wife were faithful, no affairs that anyone knew of, and they were the perfect family. He was so loved that the railroad company even put out a $100,000 reward for any information on what happened to Rob. And of course, this is always helpful because as soon as they put out that $100,000 reward, leads started pouring in. Lots of leads came. While the leads were pouring in and police were going over those leads and rifling through them and trying to find out what was credible and what wasn't, looking into all of them, police were also looking over the evidence found at the railroad station. And of this evidence was a surveillance tape. And when they watched the surveillance tape, they noted that there was a man who had arrived at the warehouse area who had a limp. And when they spoke to everyone who was there and who would know who was supposed to be there, no one could identify who this man was. 2 days after the murder was August 19th, 2004, and this was actually Rob and Sabrina's wedding anniversary. So instead of the two celebrating their love together, celebrating the 14 years they had been together, Sabrina, her kids, his coworkers, his friends, everybody who cared about him was instead gathering together to go to his memorial service. And it was a very, very sad day, as I'm sure you can imagine. Rob's son, who was named for him, Robbie, spoke at his service about his dad and the loss, and just, I can't even get into it. It'll break my heart into a million pieces. And Sabrina was so upset that she couldn't even bring herself to speak. So police end up getting their first lead when they get a tip that came in based on the surveillance footage that they had found. Somebody thought they knew who was in the surveillance footage that showed the man with the limp at the railroad yard. And this led police to a man named Josh, a young man named Josh. And when they looked into him, they were like, oh shit, I think we got something here, because they found that Josh had a light criminal record. So they bring Josh in. They question him. They take casts of his shoes that he was wearing, and guess what? The casts of these shoes match the footprints that were at the railroad yard, the warehouse yard, like in the dirt around, there was footprints found, and these shoe prints matched. Now, it's worth noting that this guy Josh was known to, for whatever reason, frequent that area. He was seen walking around there often. That's actually how somebody ended up calling him in the first place, because he was somebody who was known to be there. But either way, they were like, hell yeah, these shoe prints match. So they question him, and he gives them an alibi. He says he was at home with his parents. Now, police speak to his parents, and they corroborate this, and they were actually able to determine that his alibi was true. So they had been like, hell yeah, this is tight as fuck, we got something, to immediately being like, well shit, we don't have shit. Well shit, what are y'all doing? I have to imagine that that happens so often in investigations, where like you think, you find somebody and you're like, this is it, this has to be it, and then it turns out it's not it, and you're like, well shit, now what do we do? Like, we just got our first break, and now we have no breaks. The next tip that came to police came to them from a gunsmith, so somebody who like works on guns. And he calls police and he tells them that this guy had contacted him, right? And that this guy had wanted him to replace the firing pin in his gun because it was having trouble shooting. And from what I looked into online, this is like a very strange request. It's not like a piece of a gun that is generally replaced. So this struck the gunsmith as odd. So police go, they look into this, they investigate this person, and they're even able to take the gun and test the bullets from that gun against bullets that were recovered from Rob's skull. But when they checked this guy too was not a suspect, and the bullets did not match. So now police are moving on to wanting to re-review surveillance tapes, not just the tapes that they had, but they wanted to review other surveillance tapes in the area of like other businesses, other private residences, to see if they could see all cars that were coming in and out of that area. So they did. They got a bunch of different surveillance tapes, and they start looking into all the different vehicles that had been coming into the area. They needed to account for every single one, find out who was driving this car, what business they had being out there, since it was out in the middle of nowhere, and go through each and every one and exclude them from their list. So they do. They go through every single vehicle that showed up, and at the end of this, they realize that every single vehicle was somebody who was supposed to be there and was accounted for, except for one, a motorcycle. The only issue with this is that police could not tell from the footage who was on the bike, a license plate, anything, who was on it, why they were there, and nobody was coming forward as claiming to be this person. So they were like, huh, there's a good chance that the person riding this motorcycle is the person who was either involved in the murder or definitely may have seen something based on the time that they were there. The first like massive actual helpful lead came in this case about 2 weeks after Rob was murdered. And this was when Rob's good friend Jason, you remember Jason, Kelly, Rob, Sabrina, they were all super close. Well, his friend Jason received a very strange phone call. Well, not a phone call. Well, it was a phone call, but he received a very strange voicemail on his phone. And this voicemail was from a man that he knew, a mutual friend named Jonathan. Now, Jonathan used to work with Jason at the fire department, for reference on how he knew him. And on this voicemail, this man Jonathan, his name was Jonathan Hearn, was saying that he had the weight of God crushing down on him. and that he felt like he needed to apologize. He said that he'd like to speak to both Jason and Kelly and apologize to them for whatever pain he may have caused them. Now, who the heck is Jonathan? We're just now learning about Jonathan. Jonathan Hearn was a young dude at only 24 years old. He was known as being a kind guy, a gentle guy, one of 6 children raised in Hesperia, California, which is only about 40 minutes-ish away from Silver Lakes. He and his siblings were raised in a very religious household. They were devoutly Christian and they were homeschooled. After he graduated from high school, he had gone on to go to the fire academy. And once he had finished, he had become a firefighter, which is, what happens when you go to the fire academy, I guess. And this is where he met Jason. He had worked with Jason at the fire department and was a paramedic and was super good at his job. And he was just known as being a really bright guy. Now, this is going to seem random. It's not, I promise. But I don't know if any of you are familiar with firefighters or if any of you have ever worked at a grocery store near a firehouse. But if you have not, I'm going to give you some information. It's super, super common for there to be a couple of firefighters that are assigned the duty of going to the grocery store and buying a shit ton of stuff for the firehouse. Because, these guys are there like 24 hours a day, several days of the week. They do very long shifts. So they basically eat, sleep, live at the firehouse. So it's not uncommon for somebody to come in, buy a bunch of groceries, take it to the firehouse so that they can cook while they're there. Right? So that they can cook for everybody who's there. I worked at Food 4 Less for several years, so that's the only reason I even know about that personally. Anyways, Jonathan was one of the firefighters who did this while he was working with Jason. And the grocery store that Jonathan frequented and would buy all the grocery stores for the firehouse was Costco. Now, who do we know from this story that works at Costco? That's right, Sabrina, Rob's wife. Oh yeah, things are getting a little too spicy for the pepper. Now, Sabrina and Jonathan had met at Costco in October of 2012, and the two had really hit it off, with Jonathan even asking for Sabrina's number and Sabrina willingly giving it to him. At the time, he did not know Sabrina was married because she doesn't wear a wedding ring to work. I can't remember why. I think either you're not allowed to or her finger swelled. I think maybe you're not allowed to at Costco, which seems weird, but either way, she didn't wear a wedding ring at work. So Jonathan didn't know. And once he found out she was married, he was definitely apprehensive because he was a good Christian boy, and this went against all his values. Initially, apparently, the two just tried to be friends, but this was proving to be impossible. The two just had too strong a chemistry, and Jonathan was finding himself to be just like so entranced by her. Jonathan was kind of, because he was like homeschooled and sheltered, he had never really had a serious girlfriend before Sabrina, so when this kind of started, it was all encompassing for him. Sabrina was all encompassing for him. So it didn't take long for the relationship to progress, even though he's a good Christian boy and he shouldn't be doing this. They started having an affair by the end of 2012, which, they met in October, so it didn't take them long to give up on those morals and values. And shortly after beginning their affair, they were already saying they loved each other. Now, Sabrina's friend Kelly said of this time, she's been very vocal since all this happened. She's done a lot of interviews. And she said during this time, after Sabrina and Jonathan had met, that the wolf pack, remember all these older couples, had been having a party, and that Jonathan happened to be there. And that, Kelly knew that Jonathan and Sabrina had met at Costco because Sabrina mentioned it at one point. She didn't tell Kelly that they were, having an affair, but she had mentioned, I met one of Jason's friends at Costco, blah, 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 blah. So she knew they had met. So when Jonathan was at the party, she called Kelly, or she called Sabrina over and was like, oh my God, come over here, it's your Costco friend. They're all drinking and shit. And when Sabrina came over, she was very, very strange. Normally she'd be the type that if she ran into somebody she knew, she'd be like, oh my God, I'm so excited to see you, hugs, kisses, love, love, love. But when she ran into Jonathan, she was really standoffish and oh, cool, nice to see you, and kind of seemed like she wasn't really surprised to see him there. And at that point, Kelly remembers being like, oh shit, there's some weird energy between you two motherfuckers. What's going on here? And that's when she first kind of got a vibe that something was going on between the two of them. From that party on, Jonathan continued or started trying to weasel his way into the group circle of friends. He started wanting to be part of the wolf pack, even though he wasn't in a couple. And it started kind of innocently. He would text Jason. This was his point of contact. And he would text Jason pretty often, wanting to get together with him, wanting to get together with the group. But eventually it got to be excessive with him texting almost every single day. And Jason was kind of getting like, what the fuck is this guy's problem, man? Like he wasn't super into it. And it came to a big head one day when Jonathan texted Jason and was like, listen, bro, like I really need you to just give me your friend Rob's phone number. And this set off little alarm bells in Jason's head. I'm assuming that Kelly had mentioned to Jason the weird interaction between Jonathan and Sabrina, and that's why it set off alarm bells in his head. But either way it did. So he like contacted Jonathan and was like, listen, like what the fuck's up? Why do you need his number? What's going on? And this is when Jonathan let Jason in on a secret that he had been holding in for a while. This is when Jonathan told Jason that he, 24-year-old Jonathan, was having an affair with 33-year-old Sabrina, and that it could no longer sit on his conscience because he felt too bad about it. When Jason found this out, he was fucking pissed, and he actually went to Rob. I guess, I don't know if Rob was at his house or if he just went over to Rob like right away, but he goes to Rob like really freaked out and scared about how Rob's gonna react. He thinks it's gonna like blow up. And when he tells Rob like, hey, Jonathan's having an affair with Sabrina, like Sabrina's not being faithful, he was surprised to find that Rob like knew. Apparently Rob already knew. He had found some texts on Sabrina's phone and had confronted her about him. And the two had talked. She had told him what had been going on. He wanted to know like what was so good about this guy that would make her do this to him. And I guess he had even called Jonathan and spoke to him at that time, and was like, listen, I need you to like stop effing my wife. And whatever Rob said to Jonathan did work. It did resonate with him. He said that he felt torn because he loved Sabrina and he wanted her to feel loved by both him and by God, because he's very religious. But that he couldn't bear to hurt or disrespect her wonderful husband. But as I'm sure you can imagine, this split didn't last very long, and shortly thereafter the two were already continuing their affair, back and better than ever, and calling their love for each other and their affair God's plan. So anyways, there's Jason standing there before Rob, Jonathan on the line waiting to speak to Rob. And Rob agrees to talk to him, and I guess Jonathan admits again that the two are still having their affair. And after the two talked, things were okay. Things kind of went back to normal. Jonathan stopped seeing Sabrina. Jonathan stopped calling Jason incessantly for him to be part of the group. Everything kind of went back as being cool as a cucumber, or so it would seem. About a year after that event, after that famed phone call where Jonathan said that he'd stopped seeing Sabrina and Sabrina said that she'd stopped seeing Jonathan, Kelly was out shopping. She had gone to Costco to go shopping, you know, Sabrina's work. And what does she see? But Jonathan and Sabrina hanging out together, standing too close for comfort, chatting up a storm. So Kelly sees them. Sabrina sees Kelly see them. And she can clearly see that Kelly is pissed. She looks at him, and he looks at her, and she looks at him, and he looks at her. Anyways, Kelly, pissed, leaves Costco, goes home, tells her husband Jason, guess what I just saw. Jason calls Jonathan, pissed as fuck. Like, what are you doing, dude? Like, what's wrong with you? And Jonathan says, like, no, man, you got this all wrong. We're just friends. We have a spiritual connection. It's nothing like that. And Jonathan's like, I really don't give a fuck what you're saying right now. Okay? You had an affair with this woman. You had an affair with my friend's wife. You ruined their relationship. You caused damage to their family. You need to fuck off and go. And this is when Jonathan again agrees that he will. But spoiler alert, he doesn't again. So now we're going to fast forward a couple months. Rob has been murdered. Sabrina and her family are in mourning. This is just 2 weeks after Rob was killed. And Sabrina gets a knock on the door. And guess who's there? Effing Jonathan, dude. And he's just standing there outside her door, and he's not alone. Well, he's kind of alone. He brought with him a giant bouquet of flowers for Sabrina. And these were not just normal flowers. These were the same flowers that were in Sabrina's bouquet when she married Rob. Along with this, he brought a note where he had written all about Rob and what a good man Rob was, what like a good husband, good father, good person he was, and how he wished he could be half as good of a man as Rob was. Just weird shit, dude. And Sabrina read this letter to Kelly, to her friend Kelly, and Kelly was like, that's fucking weird, dude. Like, that's super weird. But Sabrina didn't really seem to think it was weird. She thought it was cute and it was sweet. Now, Kelly doesn't think this is so cute and so sweet like Sabrina did. And when she told her husband Jason, he didn't think so either, especially combined with this weird voicemail. It kind of got his wheels turning, and he was like, could this be Jonathan? Could Jonathan have wanted Rob dead? Like, who else? He's having an affair with her. He brings this weird letter. He sends this weird voicemail. Like, I don't know about this. So he actually goes to police and he tells them his suspicions, and he lets them listen to the voicemail. But once they listen to the voicemail, they're kind of like, you know, to me, it doesn't sound like he's admitting any fault about murder. It sounds like he feels bad for sleeping with Rob's wife, especially now that Rob's been killed. So to us, this doesn't really seem like it holds any weight. And once police say this to him, he kind of starts second guessing himself and thinking that maybe he's wrong. He's like, why, you know, I know I had just thought like it must be Jonathan, but like, why would it actually be Jonathan? Like, why would he kill Rob? He's a young dude with his whole life ahead of him. Why would he murder somebody for this older woman with 2 kids? It doesn't make sense. Now, to me, I think the reason that police brushed by this affair theory so quick is because they had already learned something about Rob and Sabrina's relationship that kind of put a thought into their head that this wouldn't have been that big of a deal. And that's that they discovered that at least some point in their relationship, Rob and Sabrina had an open marriage. They had kind of been swingers, and they had invited other people, other couples, into their marital bed. So they were thinking like, okay, if that's okay, then her having an affair with this guy like doesn't really seem to matter, because if he's down with this one thing, he's probably down with the other thing. You know what I mean? If he's cool with like being swingers, he's probably fine with her having an affair. And I know that that's not everyone's cup of tea, that sort of relationship dynamic, but this was an arrangement, an open relationship that the two had, and they were down with this sickness. Now, as time went on and there were no new leads presented and they were kind of stumped, they did start looking closer at Jonathan Hearn. And when they did, they found that like, besides the whole having an affair with a married woman thing, he was kind of a choir boy. He had no record, he had nothing going on. But despite that, there was something about him that kind of did jump out at police and made them go, huh, maybe we should look into this guy. And that was that he had a gun registered to him that was the same caliber as the gun that had been used to murder Robert. And on top of that, he also had a Yamaha motorcycle, a Yamaha bike, registered to him as well. The same kind of bike that was seen on surveillance at the murder scene at the time that Robert was killed. So now police are like, did we look past this man too quickly, perhaps? Perhaps we did. And on top of that, the police and Jason weren't the only people who had had some weird feelings about Jonathan. Apparently, Sabrina's sister, who had been there ever since Rob was killed to help her sister, had had a weird feeling about Jonathan since he first started coming over to the house, because he came over like right after Rob was killed, and he didn't stop coming over. He was there all the time. He was there all the time, spending time with Sabrina, spending time with Sabrina's kids, cooking food in the family's kitchen. That was Rob's territory when he lived there. So this was all putting a real weird taste in her mouth as well. She felt like he had been overstepping, and she felt like there was something weird going on. So police start looking at surveillance cameras on the route that one would take from Hesperia, California, which is where Jonathan lived, to Tehachapi, California, which is where Rob was killed. So they start looking at surveillance cameras on the route that one would most likely take if they were going from Hesperia to Tehachapi or vice versa. And bingo, they get some very interesting thing on the surveillance. They see a man stop at a gas station that would be on the way from Tehachapi back to Hesperia about an hour after the murder occurred, and it was a man with a limp on a motorcycle. The man was seen going into the gas station still wearing his helmet, so you couldn't see his face, unfortunately, He walks in. He notices that there are surveillance cameras that are looking right at him, and he quickly leaves, gets back on the road, headed back in the direction of Hesperia. So at this point, police do believe that the guy they're seeing on the video camera is Jonathan. So they get warrants to look at his cell records. And of course, when they look at his cell records, they see numerous texts between Jonathan and Sabrina, which makes sense because the two were having an affair. It then shows that 4 months prior to the murder, the text just stopped between the two of them because, again, the affair had stopped. But what they noted that was kind of weird is that Jonathan was the type of guy who was always on his phone. He was one of our generation, if you're my age or younger, always on his cell phone. And at the time of the murder, the day of the murders, the activity on his phone was super, super low. And at the time that the murder took place, there was zero activity, so his phone wasn't pinging anywhere. Police did see that the day after the murder, Jonathan was very active on his phone again, and in the days, several days following the murder, Jonathan was very active on his phone again, and that the number he was contacting was a number that nobody recognized. It wasn't anybody that anybody knew. And when police looked into it, they found that this was a burner phone number, and they were like, okay, this is hella fucking suspicious. Like, that's really, really weird. So they get a warrant for a wiretap. Wiretap? Yeah. Like, they tapped that phone. They tapped his cell phone so that when this burner phone called in, they could listen in and see who was on the other end. And boy, once they listened in, this case broke wide fucking open. As police listened in, they recognized the voice on the other end of the phone as that belonging to Sabrina Limon. Obviously. Right? Did you see this coming? I tried to make it more secretive throughout the case, like as I was telling it, but like, did you see it coming? Let me know down below if you did. But anyway, Sabrina and Jonathan were talking about how much they loved each other and how much they needed each other, and he was calling her his girl, and they were talking about their future and how them being together was God's plan. They would also talk about the investigation and how they were really nervous and really scared about how it was progressing. They were pretty sneaky about it, but they talked about it, but they never said anything incriminating, like directly on the phone at first. And this baby is stealing my oxygen, as always. Sabrina would even call the police to get updates on the case. And when they told her, like, we have nothing right now, like, sorry, we have nothing, because police are being really sneaky, even though they were kind of suspecting her, she would then call Jonathan, and the two would be very, very happy that nothing had been found. And the two were very religious, as I said, so they would talk about their sins, and they'd talk about how they felt like the worst people in the entire world and felt so guilty about something. They also talked about the story of Bathsheba and how their relationship was just like that of King David and Bathsheba. And apparently in this story, King David sees Bathsheba bathing naked on a rooftop and is overcome with lust. Knowing she is married, King David has Bathsheba's husband sent off to the front lines to die. That way the two can finally be together. King David, then married her and repented his crimes to God, and God was like, "You good, my boy. All's good. This is my plan." Jonathan prayed with Sabrina on the phone about this, saying, and I quote, "It's our conscience that bothers us when we realize the dirty, rotten people that we've been. And God, we're sorry for that. Amen." One time, while police were listening in real time to Sabrina and Jonathan talking on the phone, the detective texted Sabrina and sent her a picture of the motorcycle with the man on it and was like, "Hey, we think this might be the guy. Do you have any idea who this is? Does this look familiar to you?" And when she got that text, she read it to Jonathan, and the two then began praying. 3 months after the murder, both Jonathan and Sabrina were arrested for the murder of Robert Limon. And in November of 2014, Jonathan pled not guilty to the murder. The case against him was, like, entirely circumstantial, but at least there was a case against him. Sabrina, however, ended up being released just 2 days after her arrest because the DA decided there was not enough evidence present to charge her with a crime. Police could feel it in their bones that this bitch was involved, but they had no proof. There was no evidence tying her to the crime scene, and even though they had listened to hundreds of hours of phone call audio through the wiretaps, she had never once admitted to anything or even alluded to knowing that Jonathan was responsible. They even questioned her extensively, but she never gave any indication that she was involved, and she denied everything. Once Sabrina was released, pretty much all of her friends turned on her. They all believed that she was responsible, and they thought that she was essentially getting away with murder. And she could not go anywhere and escape this because, as I said, Silver Lake's small as fuck. Everyone knows everybody. Whew, she couldn't go anywhere without getting the that's her looks. That's the bitch that murdered her husband is getting away with it. So she ended up pulling her kids out of school and putting them in homeschool. And eventually, after getting tired of constantly feeling like she was hated and responsible and just like the repercussions of her actions, she ended up just up and moving to a whole new location. So to those who knew her and to those who knew Rob, it seemed like Sabrina was getting away with murder. That was until she wasn't, because just weeks before Jonathan's trial, 2 years after Robert's murder, Jonathan decides, I need to stop protecting Sabrina. So he calls up police and he's like, hey, I think I'm ready to talk now. Obviously in exchange for a little leniency, because like my trial's coming up, but I've got some information on Sabrina that I'd very much like to share with you. And police were like, oh fuck yeah, we'll be right there. Jonathan then told police that though he had murdered Rob alone, he had committed the actual murder alone, he was the one who shot him, Sabrina was a huge part of it and had taken part in planning the entire thing from the very beginning, and it was her idea. He said that Sabrina did not want to be married to Rob anymore. Sabrina wanted to be with Jonathan, but the divorce was not an option for her. She said that she would rather roll the dice on a murder charge than live with the shame and stigma of having a divorce that came from an affair. And she said that she thought her kids would have an easier time dealing with the murder of their father than the divorce of their parents. And on top of that, she had said that this was actually kind of merciful because Rob would rather be dead than be divorced because he was so into having the ideal, perfect family. And it also didn't hurt that Sabrina would get $300,000 from his life insurance if he was killed, and that she would get survivor's benefits if he was killed on the job. So Jonathan came to an agreement with the DA, with prosecution, with whoever you come to agreements with. And essentially he would plead guilty to voluntary manslaughter as opposed to murder, and he would testify against Sabrina at her trial. And initially with his first charges, he was facing life in prison with no possibility of parole, and with pleading guilty to voluntary manslaughter, which is what he was being given, he would be out in less than 25 years. Now, those who loved Rob were really, really split on this decision because this man, Jonathan, who point blank shot Rob in the chest and in the face, would be out by the time he was 50 years old, and that seemed like a giant injustice. However, police did not believe that they'd be able to get Sabrina at all. Like, she would just get away scot-free if they didn't take this deal, so they decided to take it. And after this deal was made, police drove to Sabrina's new home, which is about 100 miles away from her home in Hellendale, where she had lived with her husband, and she was arrested. And at the time she was arrested, she was so confused because she was actually scheduled to go and testify at Jonathan's trial against him, and now police were there early arresting her. And she's like, what is going on? But she was arrested. Sabrina's hearing started on September 11th, 2017, and during Jonathan's testimony at Sabrina's trial, he told the court of their relationship, of meeting her at Costco. He said that the connection was immediate and that the two bonded over a connection that, though was sexual, wasn't only sexual. It was spiritual. The two talked constantly, and eventually Sabrina told Jonathan how unhappy she was in her marriage. That the two had an open marriage and she wasn't happy with it. She wasn't happy with the way Rob treated her. Her pain and unhappiness with the relationship made him hate Rob and think that Rob was a bad person. And the two started talking at that point, talking about murdering Rob. First as a joke, but eventually it got serious and they actually started to plan it. They were going to kill Rob and then get married and continue living their lives together. He said that Sabrina wanted her husband gone and wanted to marry Jonathan so that she could give her kids, quote, godly parents. So the two put their plan in motion. They had actually tried to kill Rob earlier in 2014. They had come up with a totally different plan that didn't involve shooting him at work. And this plan was to poison Rob with arsenic. So Jonathan purchased some arsenic on the interwebs, I think. And he asked Sabrina, like, what could I mix this in that your husband will just not be able to resist? And she's like, oh, banana pudding, vanilla wafers. So he did just that. He made a big batch of banana pudding with vanilla wafers, and he mixed arsenic into this pudding. He then gave it to Sabrina so that Sabrina could then put it in her husband's lunch so he could take it to work, he could eat it, he could die. And she did just that. She packed him some lunch, she packed him some vanilla wafer banana pudding, and sent him on his way to eat it and die. But that day, while they were waiting, they started to panic. They started to worry that they weren't going to get away with this. They started to worry that they would get caught doing it this way. So they decided to call it off. And Sabrina actually texted her husband and was like, oh my God, don't eat that pudding, bro. Those bananas went bad. It's going to make you sick. And I guess he threw it out. I don't know if I would have thrown it out. I would have been like, bad bananas? Sounds to me like super sweet banana bread type bananas, and I'm going to eat this really sweet pudding, but I guess he didn't do that. At this point, the duo decided that they wanted to wait a while before trying again, because they realized that prior to this attempted murder, they had been texting and calling each other a whole lot. So if they had gone through with the poisoning, police could have connected the two of them as having an affair because of how much they spoke. And it could have looked suspicious for them. So they wanted to wait a couple months, get Sabrina a burner phone so that once his death was finally completed and investigated, they wouldn't have proof that the two had been talking. So it would be less likely that the two would be linked together as a murder conspiracy duo. Which, man, that's so much like planning and forethought. Like, it's so premeditated that they're like, okay, let's wait a couple months. Let's get a burner phone so that police can't see that we've been talking to each other all this time. And we'll talk through that, and then we'll kill him, and it'll look like we haven't talked in forever, so there'd be no reason why we would kill him for our affair. It's just like really gross how much they thought about this. Oh, and speaking of really gross, if you want to fucking hate these people even more than you already do, which I don't know how that's possible, but let me just tell you a little story about the banana pudding poisoning that's going to piss you off, okay? It's going to piss you off. When Jonathan was going through with making his arsenic pudding, he wanted to test his ratios to find out the lethalness of the batches he was making, right? So he took some of this concoction he made, he put it on some meat, and he fed it to a neighbor's dog. A dog who had, quote, caused him some considerable issues in the past. And this dog died. Fuck this guy. Fuck this guy. So anyways, the two continued planning for months, and by August of 2014, they were ready. They had their plan set. Sabrina was going to contact Jonathan and let him know when the perfect time to kill Rob would be, so that he would have an easy time getting in and out, knowing that Rob was at a certain location and was by himself. And that's actually why Jonathan was even able to kill Rob that day, because Rob was actually not even supposed to be the person working that day. He had gone in for somebody else. So that's just really, really fucked up. But anyways, he then got the word, this is where you need to go. He got a mask to cover his face. He changed the colors on his bike, his Yamaha, with some reflective tape so that if it was seen, the colors would look different and it wouldn't look like his bike. And then he faked a limp for any cameras that might see him. He went to the warehouse, and when he got there to the death scene, he says that he started to panic a little bit and started to think that maybe this wasn't the best idea. And he said of this, and I quote, "Obviously, there's some apprehension at the thought of senselessly taking someone's life." Anyways, before entering the warehouse where Rob was killed, he stood outside, Jonathan did, and prayed about it. He then entered the warehouse where he confronted Rob and shot him once in the chest with the gun he brought, along with a homemade silencer, and Rob fell to the ground. Jonathan then went through the warehouse and started staging the burglary, ransacking all the drawers, pulling everything out, throwing things all over the place, grabbing the computer to make it seem like somebody had gone there to rob the place. And on the way out, he saw Rob on the ground, and he thought to himself that Rob may still be alive, so he shot him in the face to finish the job. And once he left, he called Sabrina and let her know that the deed was done and things had gone A1, baby, according to plan. The defense did their best to discredit Jonathan. They talked about his plea deal and how much he stood to gain from making up a fake story about Sabrina and claiming that she was involved when she wasn't. They tried to discredit the arsenic banana pudding story, saying that it made no sense that Sabrina would bring home poisonous pudding to keep in her fridge where anyone, including her kids, could eat it. They also, the defense, tried to discredit Kelly, Sabrina's friend, who was pretty vocal about the fact that she believed that Sabrina was responsible. They put her on the stand, and he made her admit that Kelly and Jason were having a sexual relationship with Sabrina and Rob. They had been swinging together. That's why the couples were so close. And that because of that, Kelly was in love with Rob. And that's why she was making up stories about Sabrina. Now, for me, I'm like, that seems a little desperate on the defense's part. Like, I don't know. It just seems in bad taste to me. It feels weird. Like, I get it. She was testifying against Sabrina and saying that she believes Sabrina did it and told the police about all these weird interactions and weird things. But it just seems kind of desperate for the defense to be like, well, you guys were all fucking each other, right? So you must have fallen in love, and that's why you're saying this now. Like, it just seems odd, but that's just me. Maybe there's more to it that you guys might see, but to me, I'm like, okay. The defense also ended up putting Sabrina on the stand to testify on her own behalf, which is not something that we always see. And during her testimony, she talked about Jonathan, and she talked about her attraction to him and how she was attracted to him because he was unlike anybody else that she had ever known, that he was a good man and a godly man, and that the two were connected spiritually, and that she was just so unhappy in her marriage, and that she was ashamed of her swinger lifestyle, and that Jonathan would never have made her do that. She said Jonathan was intelligent and safe and strong and God-fearing, and that he simultaneously controlled her and made her feel safe at the same time, because he always had and was quoting and reading to her the Bible. She told the court that she was in love with Jonathan, but that she was in love with her husband too, and that she wanted to be with Jonathan, but she didn't want to be with Jonathan at the expense of losing her current life and her current husband, because she loved them both. And by having Rob alive and in a relationship with her and having an affair with Jonathan, she was basically having her cake and eating it too. She was living the best of both worlds, so why would she want to change that? She denied ever poisoning her husband. She denied having any involvement in the murder. She denied knowing that Jonathan had any involvement in the murder, and she told the court that if she had known that he was involved, she would have never had him around her or her kids. The prosecutor on this case said of this case and of Sabrina, and I quote, "This is not a case of he said, she said. This is a case of he said, she lied." It took the jury less than 7 hours to come back with their verdict. Sabrina Limon was found guilty of the first-degree murder of her husband, Robert Limon, along with charges for conspiracy, accessory, and solicitation to commit murder. And Sabrina was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison for her husband's murder. A month later, Jonathan had his sentencing hearing, and during this time, he made a statement to Rob's family and his loved ones, and he said, and I quote, "I have sinned. I am guilty of choices that have torn awful wounds in many hearts, rippling destructively through so many precious lives. I have fallen terribly short of the standards of Jesus, who commands to serving each other and to be humble and to love one another. I have evoked God's name and yet behaved exactly opposite of his dictates. I have sinned. I am aware that for my crimes, anything other than death is merciful. Yet for my sin, I truly deserve much worse. I have wept and struggled looking for adequate words to express my repentance. It seems like saying that I'm sorry to you all will never be enough. And so, speaking on borrowed and undeserved breath, I offer you my broken-hearted and genuine apology, knowing that it cannot compare to the grief that I've caused you." Sabrina and Rob's children live with Sabrina's sister, and the two families are very divided because a lot of them believe, obviously, that Sabrina's guilty, but Sabrina's sister and her kids don't believe that she is. Sabrina did even try to get a new trial already, and during this time for her trial, her kids wrote letters to the judge asking that their mom simply get probation instead of having to serve time in jail, which is just really, really sad. These poor kids losing both parents. But the judge did not grant her a new trial and her sentence remained. The judge said of this, and I quote, "Letters from the defense reiterate that the defendant is a kind and loving woman incapable of this crime. However, 12 jurors sat in that box and convicted her of the murder." And Sabrina's attorney says that they do plan to appeal again in the future, that they have plans to continue trying to appeal, but that they don't feel confident that it will be successful. So I guess only time will tell. But yeah, that's it, guys. That is the story of the murder of Robert Limon. What do you think? Isn't that just so messed up? It makes me so mad. This guy was literally just trying to work, just at his job, trying to support his family, who he loved and worked so hard for and did everything for, and he was just shot at work for no reason at all. It's so frustrating. And the fact that they said that they did it because of God's plan makes me so annoyed. I'm sorry, but it makes me so frustrated, the religious aspect of this, because I have such a problem with anyone who tries to justify doing something absolutely horrible for religious purposes. I think that that is the absolute worst. It reminds me like very, very loosely of Midnight Mass. Did you guys see that show? Well, actually it doesn't, because at least in Midnight Mass, those people thought they were doing something good. Jonathan and Sabrina knew they weren't doing something good. That's why they were riddled with guilt and had to pray about it all the time, because they knew what they were doing was awful. So these dicks were just selfish, dude. They were banking on the fact that they could do this and then ask for forgiveness and be saved. And that is gross. I am genuinely curious, though, on whether or not you think Sabrina was involved. I do personally think she was involved, but I can understand why somebody wouldn't, because the case they have against her is super flimsy and almost non-existent without the testimony of Jonathan. Like, there's no, like, direct evidence. I mean, there is a lot of things that if you look at them with critical thinking, you can put together a picture that's pretty fucking clear. But I can see why somebody would be on the fence about this one. But I don't know, because a lot of people who knew the couple and were around at that time and who knew them as people do think that she was involved. So I don't know, go back and forth. I mean, I don't. I think she did it, but I guess we'll call that the question of the day. Do you think Sabrina was involved, or do you think that Jonathan acted alone? Let me know down below. But anyways, guys, that completes this video. I hope you found it interesting and informative, and it gave you all the information you would want when looking into this case. And of course, I want to thank you for remembering Robert with me today, because he just sounded like a cool fucking dude. He sounded like the kind of guy that, I mean, everyone liked him. His family loved him, his friends loved him, and you can just tell what a loss he was for people based on everything that's ever said about him. Like, there's never a bad word, except for from his wife. And he was killed. And that's it. And you can't take it back, and he's gone forever for no reason. And that's really fucking sad. Come gather around and let me tell you the story of the horrific murder of 26-year-old Keona Braxton. Our story today begins on December 31st, 2008, New Year's Eve. It was just after 6:30 in the morning when a call came into 911 from an apartment complex called the Noel at Brook Hill on Crenshaw Road in Virginia. Now, residents woke in this building to the smell of smoke. So worrying that there might be a fire coming from an upstairs apartment, because that's where like the origin of the smoke was, they called the police and they called the ambulances because they were worried that like a fire was in the building and was going to spread and kill everybody. Obviously, you know how fires work. We all know how fires work. So police came, firefighters came. They go to the apartment. They knock on the door, the apartment that the smoke's coming out. They knock on the door and they get no response. So they break down that door. Like, they've got to get in. There's a fire that needs to be put out. But when they went in that apartment, they could not have been prepared for the sight they were about to see. Once they entered that apartment, they saw that there was blood everywhere. Like, it was on fire, yes, but it was also covered in blood. And as they moved through the apartment, they found the origin of the blood. And that was that there was a woman, like a young woman, who had been viciously attacked, and she was at the back of the apartment near the patio door, and she was still alive, but she was struggling to live. So they tried to do all they could. They tried to perform life-saving measures, but unfortunately she was not able to be saved, and she was pronounced dead at the scene. Now, this woman had obvious physical signs of trauma that were not related to the fire. Like, the fire had not done this to her. So it became clear right from the jump that Whoever set this fire was doing so in an attempt to try to hide what they had done to this woman. And this woman was 26-year-old Kiona Braxton, 26-year-old pregnant Kiona Braxton. And she had been viciously murdered in her own home, the place where she was supposed to feel safe. Now, who was Kiona? Kiona Cecilia Tyree Braxton was born on July 3rd, 1982 to parents Joyce and Tommy, but it looks like she was raised by Joyce and Joyce's husband, William, so her stepfather. Kiona was the baby of the family. She had 3 older sisters, Carmita, Tamil, and Toshiba, and 2 older brothers, Michael and Victor, and she had a huge extended family with grandparents and cousins and aunts and uncles, and she was super close with her family, who called her Kiki or Ki. And she was particularly close with her nieces and nephews. She was that type of aunt that was very enthusiastic about her babies, and she loved them. So Kiona was raised in Richmond, and since she was the baby of the family, her mom said that she was very loved. She actually straight up used the word spoiled. This little girl got everything she wanted, and it's because she was very sweet and very well loved, and everyone who came in contact with her thought she was the greatest little kid, and she was super close with again, her family, her siblings and her were so close. They had their own bedrooms. All the girls had their own bedrooms. This house had 4 bedrooms, but all of them chose to sleep together in one room. She was happy. She was beautiful. She took pride in her appearance, always making sure to get her hair done and her nails done. But she was also very practical and was the planner of her family. She liked things done on her terms, and she liked to be in control of her life. Kiona was caring and outgoing and lovely, and she had a very strong urge to live life to the fullest because she felt like life was a gift from God. She was a very religious woman, and she was said to have a deep love for God in her heart that never died, and she lived her life very much worshiping him. She always had him in her heart. She was pretty and popular in junior high and high school, and she got good grades. Actually, all of her siblings got really good grades. She went to and graduated from Thomas Dale High School in 2001, and then she went on to get a good job. She had been working for a company called Prudential Clean Room Service, and she was a soil sort leader, and she had been there for 3 years prior to her murder, and she was very good at her job. She was very dependable, and she was very popular amongst her coworkers, and she was even up for a promotion. She was about to be promoted to a manager's position, and she really, really liked this job. She was actually meant to be there that morning at 6 a.m., but now instead, cops are showing up at her apartment. They're finding it on fire, and she's murdered, and they need to figure out why. So actually, when police initially got this call, they did not know that it was a murder. They just knew that an apartment was on fire and that somebody had died. So they had no idea what they were going into on this scene, because in hearing that an apartment was on fire and somebody had died, they figured that it was likely just because of smoke inhalation. So when they walked into Kiona's apartment and they saw the state that she was in, it was completely shocking. She was in terrible shape. An autopsy determined that Kiona was not the only target of this attack because, not only had Kiona been hit in the head 12 times, but she had been stabbed over 40 times in the abdomen and shot in the abdomen. She was actually shot a few times, and this all led police to believe that her baby, because remember, she was pregnant. She was 3 months pregnant at this time. Police believed, because of all of the damage that had been sustained to her abdomen, that the baby was also a target of this murder, and that whoever killed her was unhappy that she was pregnant. One of the officers working the scene was like, there's no way it's a coincidence that all of these stab wounds were centralized to this area and one of the gunshots. That doesn't make any sense. And they also were so. Believed that whoever did this killed her, killed the baby intentionally, and then set fire to the house to try to hide what they had done, hoping that people would come and just think that she got burned up in a fire. In the kitchen, they found that all the burners on the stove were turned to high, and the knobs were actually removed from the stove, which doesn't look suspicious at all. And inside the oven, they found that somebody had actually stuffed it with aerosol cans. So they believed that somebody did all of this to make the apartment actually explode, which would have gotten rid of a lot of the evidence of what had happened here. Whoever was responsible after killing Kiona then went upstairs, because this was a townhouse style apartment, so they went to the second floor where the bedroom was, and they set fire up there using old wrapping paper, because remember, this is December 31st. It had just been Christmas. So somebody put all the wrapping paper together, I think on the bed, and then used an accelerant to make everything burn faster. Luckily, though, police were able to still get some evidence because the fire hadn't been successful in destroying everything, and they recovered from this apartment, quote, knives, firearms, ammunition or casings, fibers, and blood, as well as evidence of, quote, flammable liquid. evidence. Specifically, the most important things I think is that they found the knife that was used to stab Kiona, and they found a bullet casing from when she had been shot. Now, her family was devastated, dude. They were like, how could this happen? She was literally in the prime of her life. She was so happy. She was just about to get a promotion at work. She had just found out she was pregnant. She was newly pregnant, only 3 months, and she was so excited about it. She was said to be like bursting at the seams and not able to control how excited she was about her future. She was one of those people who had never expected to get pregnant. Like, that wasn't a goal she had for her life. But now that she was, it was like a light switched off in her head, which I can totally relate to, where she was just so excited at the thought of being a mom. And she was super excited specifically because she actually had a partner to do this with. Sometimes you're not lucky enough to have that, but she did, because her and her live-in boyfriend Kenny were set to get married. So Kenny and Kiona had met in December of 2004 when Kiona was just 22 years old, and she felt pretty quickly that he may be the one for her. The two met at her work. He was a driver for the cleaning company where she worked, and she was like, oh, he's super cute, like I'm super into him. So they started talking, and then they started dating, and she quickly brought him home to her family, and they liked him, and they thought he was a nice guy, and they knew that she really wanted to be with him, and it looked to them like he really wanted to be with her too. They seemed like a really good couple. He was the type of guy that just like showered her with affection. I mean, the two even went on a trip to the Bahamas that I believe he completely paid for. He was just said to be like very good to her. Now, he did have a little bit of baggage when he got into the relationship that could make somebody be like, I'm not sure if this is for me, especially somebody as young as Kiona. Like, what? My brain turned off for a second. Let me rewind for a second. Yes, okay. He had a baby. Like, he already had a child. He had been in a long-term relationship with his high school sweetheart. This was a girl named Kayla, and the two of them had a daughter together. And I know for some people that is a bit of a deal breaker. Like, it probably wouldn't be for me since I am a mom, but I'm also married, so it doesn't apply. But I know some people are kind of like, you can only, once you have a kid, you can only date other people with kids, right? You hear that. That's what Donald Glover says, at least. But for Kiona, this was not the case. She actually loved seeing Kenny as a dad. She would look at him and see how great he was as a father to his daughter, and it made her love him even more. So the two get serious. Kenny and Kiona move in together. They set up a bedroom inside their apartment for when Kenny's daughter's there so that she can stay with him, because they have him and his previous woman, his baby's mother, have a joint custody situation. So sometimes the daughter was with him, sometimes the daughter was with her mom. So whenever she would come over, they had a bedroom set up for her, and they were just like a happy little family, with Kiona playing like the role of a stepmother to this little girl. And reportedly this little girl even called her mom before. And this arrangement for the time being was great for her, because she had never really planned on having kids of her own. So this was her way of kind of stepping into that role without having to, you know, get pregnant and give birth, which some people like. I certainly did not, and I can imagine why she wouldn't want to do that, because for the longest time, neither did I. But then around Thanksgiving 2008, she found out that she herself was pregnant as well, and she changed her tune completely, and she was super excited to have a baby, get married, and have that chapter of her life begin. So back to the murder. Kenny initially seemed like he had no idea anything had happened. He was actually away at work at the time that she was murdered, and the apartment was set in the fire. The fire was set in the apartment, and he only found out about it because a neighbor actually called him, because, you know, he was away at work. So he got a little panicky, and he started calling Kiona to find out what was going on, but he got no response. And with every unanswered call, he seemed to get more and more worried. So he actually reached out to her family so that they could go and check on her, since he wasn't there to do so. So her mother did. Her mother rushed over to see what was going on, and she said when she got there, she just saw that there was an ambulance leaving her daughter's apartment, but that the siren wasn't on. And because the siren wasn't on, she just had like a sinking feeling in her chest, because she knew that that wasn't anything good. And it was quickly confirmed that she was right, because an officer came and took her to the side and like sat her down in a police car and informed her that her daughter and her future grandbaby were dead. And she just lost it. Now, even though Kenny said that he was away at work when this murder took place, the police still wanted to talk to him. They'd want to talk to him anyways, because he is the boyfriend. But in addition to being the boyfriend, he is the boyfriend of a woman who's recently found out she's pregnant, and a lot of her attacks seem to be centrally located to her abdomen, which is already weird. But when you add the fact that when police talked to Kiona's sister, they found out that Kenny actually wasn't too stoked to find out that Kiona was pregnant. Like, he wasn't excited initially that the baby was on the way. That made police look at him a little harder. Now, he said that he wasn't super stoked about the fact that she was pregnant at first because he already had a kid. He had a daughter named Michaela with his high school sweetheart, Kayla and Michaela. And he felt like that kind of chapter of his life was done, so he wasn't like stoked to have to do the whole baby thing all over again. So even though Kiona reportedly told her mother that Kenny had warmed up to the idea and was now excited to be a father again, her sister Tamil was kind of wondering if maybe he wasn't really that excited about it. Maybe he was lying when he said he was okay with it, and maybe he felt like this, getting rid of Kiona, was his way out of the situation. She said that she did think that Kiona and Kenny always seemed like they loved each other, and that her family was super accepting of him and super excited at the fact that the two were going to get married. She had just always kind of gotten a weird vibe from him and felt like he was hiding something. So now police, they want to know what that might be. So police have to wait to meet with Kenny because he's out, you know, working far away. So he makes the hours drive back, and when police finally get a chance to sit down and talk with him, their first question is like, okay, so where were you when your girlfriend was murdered? And he tells police that when Kiona was attacked, he was out of town. He was actually out of the state doing deliveries near Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, born and raised. Now, I'm sure they were surprised to find that his alibi actually checked out. He had cell phone records that showed he was in that area. He had hotel receipts. He even had his work saying that all of the deliveries that he was meant to make, that he was like scheduled to make in that area, were scheduled on time. So it wasn't really possible for him to be doing his deliveries in Philadelphia and be back in Virginia murdering his girlfriend. Now, even if his alibi hadn't checked out, they did notice some other things while interviewing him that made them feel like he probably wasn't the guy. And one of the things was that while he was being questioned, he was asking questions. He was asking, like, who did this? How did it happen? When did it happen? etc, etc. And this is something that police look out for, because sometimes when somebody's not asking questions, it's because they already know the answers to the questions. They don't have to ask. So he was quickly ruled out, but they didn't take their eyes off him completely, because they were like, even if he didn't do it, he might know something. I mean, he's the closest person to Kiona. They're together every day. He lives with her. And they were right, because when they asked Kenny if he knew anybody who would want to hurt his girlfriend, he said yes, he knew somebody who would want to hurt her. He knew somebody who flat out hated Kiona. And this was his ex-girlfriend, the mother of his daughter, Kayla Camille Armstrong. Now, immediately, this made police's ears perk up, because during the time that Kenny was driving back from Philadelphia to meet with police in Virginia, they had, interviewed other witnesses. They're not just going to sit around for all those hours and wait for him. So they had already gone and spoken to Kiona's family. And when they asked her family the same question, they said the same thing. They said that Kayla Armstrong was an absolute menace to Kiona, made her life a living hell, and they were 100% sure that she had something to do with the murder. They actually also believe that Kenny might have something to do with it, and maybe the two, work together. Now, Kayla. Kayla was a Virginia State University student majoring in management, and her classmates, people who knew her from the school, said that she was outgoing, smart, and fun, which is wild because everyone who knew her across the board, well, almost everyone who knew her across the board, said that she was a good person. She was a good mother. She was known to be a religious woman who wanted to go out and become a preacher. Everyone who knew her had nothing but good things to say about her. That was, except for Kenny and Kiona when she was alive, and Kiona's family now that she was deceased, because they said that they got to see the worst parts of Kayla, basically. And Kayla was incredibly jealous of Kiona since day one. As soon as her and Kenny broke up and he moved on with somebody else, it was like she could not deal. He was said to be done with the relationship, but she absolutely was not and would not take no for an answer. And so she started harassing Kiona, and she was able to somehow, I don't know how, I have suspicions as to how, but I don't know how, but she was able to get Kiona's phone number. And she started texting her over and over, harassing her over text, but it didn't stay at just texts. It turns out that 18 months prior to Kiona's murder, she and Kayla had gotten into an altercation that became physical, and they started to fight. And Kayla took a knife and stabbed Kiona in the head. In the head. It required her to get 22 stitches for the stab wound to her head, and Kayla was, of course, arrested, and she was charged with felony assault, but she only served 4 months for this crime. So that's not a very long amount of time for stabbing somebody in the head. So once she got out, Kiona was scared. This fight and how serious it got was kind of a wake-up call for her on how intense and dangerous this was. And once Kayla was out of jail, Kiona was right, because the harassment just continued. Like, for example, just months before Kiona was murdered, her apartment was broken into and it was vandalized. Now, they never were able to say definitively who did this, who broke into her apartment, who vandalized it. They had an idea who, but they couldn't say for sure. But whoever did do it wrote all over Kiona's walls. And what they wrote were things about still being intimate with Kenny, about how this person was still banging Kenny. And they wrote about a mark, like a birthmark, or was it a tattoo? It was a tattoo. And it was a tattoo that Kiona had that was on like an intimate part of her body that one would not know about unless one had seen it while being intimate with her. So somehow this person knew about that. So they didn't know this was Kayla, but it definitely sounds like it probably was. Things got so bad that finally Kiona just couldn't take it anymore, and she decided she was going to get a restraining order. The harassment was relentless. She was threatening her all the time. She said in this application for the restraining order that she was getting calls and texts where Kayla was just threatening her, saying she was going to attack her, saying she was going to add more stitches to her head, referring to when she had literally stabbed her. And she said in these restraining orders that she was scared for her life and scared this girl was going to kill her. And Kiona's sister said of this, quote, "My sister would go to court for a restraining order and she would tell the judge, this girl is trying to kill me. Kayla is trying to kill me. She is going to kill me." Now, Kiona did get this restraining order. It was issued to her. And part of the restraining order, like one of the conditions, was that when Kayla would come to drop her daughter off at the apartment that Kenny and Kiona shared, she had to stay in the car because, they shared a daughter, so they had to do a drop off and before Kayla would come in the house. And the restraining order said obviously she couldn't do that. But 3 days before Kiona was murdered, when Kayla came to either drop off or pick up her daughter, I can't remember which, she just burst in the apartment without notice, without being allowed to. And so Kiona gets up and is like, "What the fuck are you doing here?" Obviously, and a fight broke out. It got so bad that Kenny had to step in and separate the two. And this situation makes me so frustrated when I think about this, when I picture this in my head, because you're doing this, right? And you're doing this in front of your kid. It's just so petty. How is this good for your child? How is it good for your child to see you being violent to another person, and all because you can't let go of a relationship that's run its course? I get being heartbroken. I get being so sad that life didn't go the way you wanted it to go, and that all the plans you had made with this person, because they were together a while, all the plans that you made for your future were revolved around this person and involved this person. So now in losing them, it feels like not only have you lost them, but you've lost your future. I get that. But she took it to the obsessive. For example, in one police report, Kiona wrote that Kayla had said to her, quote, "Kenny and I have a daughter together, and for that reason, if no other, we will always be together, and he will always be my man. No woman will ever take him away from me. I won't let it happen." So clearly now that Kiona's been murdered, police want to talk to Kayla, so they have to try to find her. They have to hunt her down, and this isn't easy. It takes a little while, but when they finally find her, they actually find her at a storage center where I guess she had been living. And when they find her, she's hiding under a desk, which is a choice, but they get her and they're like, "Okay, we're gonna take you into custody now." So they bring her in and they question her. And of course she denies everything. She denies all involvement. And she even tries to downplay the fights between her and Kiona as simply new girlfriend and baby mama drama. But then during the interview, police mentioned that Kiona was pregnant at the time she was killed. And Kayla had an outburst that she didn't seem to be able to control. She was basically "I knew it." Actually, she said specifically, quote, "I was right." Another thing that police noticed during this interview that was kind of weird that stuck out to them is okay, you know how sometimes your body will betray you, or we'll see in these cases where you're trying to say something, or in this instance, you're trying to lie about something, and all the words are coming out the way you want them to, but your body betrays you in that it does things involuntarily. You have these little tics that come out even though you're not meaning to, and police kind of catch on to that. Well, in this instance, Kayla, as soon as she started talking about the murder, she started belching over and over. They couldn't tell she was doing it on purpose or if she wasn't doing it on purpose, but it got to the point that one of the officers was like, "What the fuck are you doing right now?" And she had no answer. Now, even though they didn't have enough on Kayla to arrest her for Keona's murder, they seemed like they still wanted to hold on to her while they looked into her for this further. They didn't say that. They didn't say that they were arresting her for this. What they said was that they were going to be arresting her for the assault that she had committed on Keona 3 days earlier when she broke the restraining order and went into Keona's home. So they arrested her for that, but really I think they were just holding her so that they could investigate her further, because this is something police do all the time. And in the meantime, they also got her cell phone records. Now, she did have an attorney, and her attorney protested this big time. They were like, you are arresting her for something and saying for one thing and saying it's something else for one. And if you're going to actually arrest her on this, because I guess this is something she did, you should at least give her bond so she can get out, because she's not being arrested for murder right now. She's being arrested on like a suspected assault. But it doesn't look like she ever made bond, or at least if she did, she wasn't able to raise the money because she did remain in jail. Kayla sat in jail for 6 months for the assault before a judge actually threw the case out because he didn't feel like there was enough evidence to show who had instigated the fight, so she was released from jail. Which is so wild to me because she had literally gone into Keona's house, so I don't know what this judge was thinking, especially since Keona had a restraining order, but I couldn't find clarification on how they came to this decision. When she left jail, she was happy, she was smiling, she was surrounded by friends and family, and when she was asked by reporters like how she kept her chin up during the time that she had to actually spend in jail, because she was in there for months, she said it was all because of the support of her mother, her daughter, and her friends. Now, apparently Kayla being released was problematic for the detectives working Keona's case. They said that it really put a huge wrench in what they were doing, and it set the case back because once she was released, a lot of the witnesses they were trying to work with were harder to deal with once she was out of jail. And unfortunately, they really hadn't made much progress in the case. During the 6 months that Kayla was in jail, they had been investigating, but they didn't find anything solid. They didn't find any smoking gun that actually linked Kayla to Keona's murder. In fully looking over the crime scene, they weren't able to find anything, no evidence that concretely linked Kayla, or anyone else for that matter, to the murder. They did say that they had found some DNA, that they found DNA in like 2 places in the apartment, but they didn't clarify what this was, whose it was, and clearly it wasn't bulletproof enough to make a difference in this case because it didn't. They did, however, find some circumstantial evidence, and this evidence at least made them feel like they were going in the right direction by suspecting Kayla for Keona's murder. They discovered that the night before the murder, because technically, you know, she was murdered after midnight, Kayla had placed several phone calls to Keona's next door neighbors, which is weird, but basically she was calling to see if Kenny was home that night. She was calling over and over, and they believe she was doing this to see if Keona was alone. So investigators really felt like this was helping add to their pile of circumstantial evidence. Still, the prosecutor did not believe that they had enough evidence to bring Kayla to court for the murder of Keona, so years went by with her family just sitting there waiting for justice. And I don't know how anyone deals with that, just sitting there and having no answers, like knowing in your heart what happened but not being able to legally do anything about it. I don't know how anyone does that. And Keona's mother said that she just gave it up to God, that she trusted in God to have the right result come out, and that he brought her through all the trauma she was dealing with. Now, speaking of her mother, just speaking of her family in general, they were so heartbroken, dude. Their whole community was. This case had such an emotional impact on everyone who knew Keona or knew of Keona that the local preacher asked for peace and for everyone not to allow this tragedy, the tragedy of her murder, to cripple them. He asked his community to just let police do their jobs, but he did acknowledge that whoever did this to Keona, that what happened to her was misguided, wicked, and evil. January 8th, 9 days after Keona's murder, her funeral was held, and this was the hardest day of her family's lives. I mean, they had lost a sister, a daughter, a friend, a mother, you know what I mean? And she laid there in an open casket, and she was wearing like a dark suit, and what really destroyed me is I read a note that they laid a yellow like baby blanket or baby towel over her chest for her child. And then at the front of the service, there was a huge 10-foot photo of Keona just smiling. And it was just such a sad service, man, because everyone knew her and everybody loved her because she was such a religious woman too. The pastor who was presiding over her funeral, this was Pastor Harold, had known her her whole life. And throughout the service, he just referred to her as their Kiki. And as for her funeral, it was incredibly sad. Like, tensions were very high. Nobody wanted Kenny to be there, but he did go, which caused some tension. He did sit in the back throughout the service and he kept his head down, but this didn't really last because once the service was done and it moved to the graveside burial, which, you know, if you've been to a funeral, you know, it's just separate. It's what you do after. So everybody went and a huge altercation broke out there with Kenny getting in a fight with like a shit ton of people. And it started small, but it blew up into a bunch of people fighting, which didn't surprise me because like 60 cars went to the cemetery for the burial. So like 24 people are fighting each other at the funeral, which I can only imagine how heartbreaking that would be for her family to see. But also, I'm sure some of them participated because there's just so much built up anger. And I guess the cops did come, but when they came, the people just scattered and the police didn't try to catch them to like arrest them for the fighting because they understood what everybody was going through. After her funeral, her family just got together and they shared a meal together while they just tried to come to grips with what they had lost. Keona's family, dude, they just sounded like good ass people. Like it was very clear in reading about them that Keona was raised in she was raised right and in a loving home. Her family was known as taking in many children who were in bad situations and they helped raise them. The pastor at her funeral said like her family was known to be a family who, if you needed help, if you had a child you couldn't provide for, this family was there for you. And now they had lost their own baby and there was no real answers for that. But that's not to say that nobody was trying, because they were. Like the lead investigator on Keona's case was very invested in solving it. He had poured everything he had into her investigation since day one. He said that it was incredibly tough to not be able to solve it, and it was that case that kept him up at night thinking about it, just wondering if there's anything else that he could have done so that it could actually be solved. It would take 3 years for any significant movement to be made on this case, but once it did, things got very interesting. So 3 years after Keona's murder, a new Commonwealth attorney took on the case, and they decided that they would take it to trial. Now, I didn't know what a Commonwealth attorney was, so I took it to the Google machine, and basically it's just a DA. So there was a new DA on the case, and they decided they would take Kayla to trial. An indictment was issued, and they went to arrest her, but it appeared that she had gotten wind of this because she ran. She straight up dipped, leaving her home, completely cleaning out her apartment, and just ditching her young child. And police believed that she was able to run because her family was helping her, or at least that they knew she was running and knew where she was. So they went to her mother and they were like, hey, you need to tell her to just turn herself in because she can't run forever and it's going to get worse for her if we have to find her. Keona's family had been so relieved to know the case was going to get taken to trial. So when they learned that she had ran, that she was unable to be found and maybe left the state, they were really upset, but they were also confident that she would be brought to justice. They were just kind of like discouraged, right, that it was going to be so hard to find her, but they decided that they wanted to hold out hope. They decided that instead of panicking, right, instead of panicking because she was on the run and waiting on bated breath for her to be caught, they decided that that weekend, the weekend that it was announced that she was going to be arrested and that she was on the run, they were going to have a celebration of Keona's life instead. Then they finally caught her. It's January 20th, 2012. I want you to picture this with me. It's January 20th, 2012, and the U.S. Marshals track Kayla, that's her name, Kayla, to a friend's house. They knock on the door. The man who lives there opens the door, and he gives them permission to search the house. He's like, go for it. I have nothing to do with this. So they go. They search the house high and low when they come to a closet. The officer opens the closet, and there's all this stuff hanging there. We've seen a closet. So he just reaches through the clothes. And what does he find? But a human arm. I honestly can't make this up. She's literally just like hiding in a closet and she thinks that's gonna work. People are interesting. That's the most I can say about that. So she's arrested that night at 11:30 p.m. and she's charged with first-degree murder. And then somehow it gets even crazier, dude. So she's in jail. She's awaiting trial. She's been in jail waiting for trial for about a year when she gets accused of trying to hire a hitman. Apparently what had happened is that Kayla had learned the man she did all of this over, the man she loved, the father of her child, Kenny, was intending to testify against her at trial. And when she found this out, this simply would not do. So she tried to hire somebody for $2,000 to murder Kenny so he couldn't testify at her trial. And the person she tried to hire was a jailhouse informant. Bro, okay. So she tries to get a hitman by trying to hire this jailhouse snitch who was like, that's not what I do, but let me refer you to somebody. And she refers him to this hitman who is actually an undercover cop pretending to be a hitman. Like, ma'am, we've seen this play out so many times. So she talks to this guy and she tells this guy she wants him murdered, and she wants him murdered in such a way that his family does not get an open casket because she's an evil bitch. And then once the jailhouse snitch gets out of jail, she tries to call him 250 times. She calls him over and over and over. She was very serious about this plan. And she thought that she was being super smart while doing this because she was trying to hide the fact that she was making these calls by using another prisoner's PIN, which we've heard about this before. It's what they use to call out so that calls can be monitored. So she tries to use another, I keep wanting to say employee, but it's prisoner, another prisoner's PIN. But all these calls are recorded. So police sit there and they listen to the recordings and they hear her trying to hire somebody to kill Kenny. And it wasn't like a casual thing where she's like, I want him dead. No, she went through extensive lengths to actually have him killed. Police were stunned. They were like, she's already in jail for a murder and then sits here and tries to plot another murder? Who the fuck is this chick? And she, of course, denies it, even though she's caught literally red-handed. She's like, wasn't me, pulled a Shaggy, wasn't me, and refuses to take any responsibility at all. Now, as I said in the beginning, Kayla didn't even end up going through a trial because she was offered and did accept a plea deal. And it's frustrating because it does seem so obvious that it's her, right? But it is entirely circumstantial. There's no physical evidence. There's no DNA. They don't have a murder weapon. They can't even prove that Kayla was in Keona's house. So, since she was being charged with more than one thing, Kayla entered 2 pleas. So first, for the attempted capital murder and solicitation to commit capital murder, she did plead guilty. And this was for her trying to hire somebody to kill Kenny. She did plead guilty to that. But when it came to Keona, she didn't plead guilty to this. She instead took an Alfred plea, where basically she was acknowledging that the police had enough evidence to possibly get a conviction against her if they went to court, but she wasn't actually admitting any guilt in doing it. She's like, listen, you have enough to get me, but still I didn't do it. That's essentially what her Alfred plea was for. She refused to admit any responsibility when it came to Keona's murder. She did the opposite. She said that she was a loving person, a loving mother, a woman of God, and that she would never do anything like this, but she felt like she had to. Why she felt like she had to, she didn't really explain, but she felt like this deal was the best thing she could do, which is why she accepted it. And she said that she believed in accepting this deal, she would only get 14 years, though I'm not sure why she thought that. She accepted this plea, which we've seen before, and after she accepted it, she tried to pretend like she didn't understand what she had agreed to. And that's not how it works, because the judge had went through extensive measures to make sure she understood. They go through a lengthy series of questions to make sure you understand what you're agreeing to. And she did, but then afterwards she's like, but I didn't get it. And I guess she even tried to withdraw her plea agreement or just try to get a new trial altogether, but the judge denied that, saying she had no grounds to do so. So she was going to be sentenced, and the prosecutor asked the judge that the court just show Kayla the same mercy and compassion that she had shown Keona. Kayla did what she could to try to save herself. She gave a statement to the court in which she said, quote, I am imperfect and am a human being saved by grace. I am not an animal. The judge disagreed, though, and said to her, quote, in my opinion, you have no regard for human life. She was then given her punishment. So, for the voluntary manslaughter, she was given 10 years. The range for this was 1 to 10 years, so she was given the max. For attempted capital murder, she was given 60 years with 40 years suspended. The range was 20 years to life. And for attempted solicitation to commit capital murder, she was given 40 years, but it was also suspended, and the range for this was 5 to 40 years. So she was given the max, but it was suspended. So in total, she was given 110 years, but 80 of those years were suspended. And for the life of me, I do not understand the point of suspended sentences. Why even give a sentence if you're just going to suspend it? If you know, if you're a legal guy or gal or person, let me know down below what the fuck, because I don't get it. But basically what this means is she was sentenced to 30 years, and she has to serve 85% of those 30 years before she is eligible for parole. This would put her in her 50s when she is first set to be released, and apparently, if I understand correctly, it also means that if she breaks the law again while she's out of jail, she has to complete the rest of her sentence. But I'm not entirely clear on that, but that's the way it read. Whatever. As soon as Kayla was sentenced, one of Keona's family members jumped to their feet and yelled at her that they hoped that she died in prison. Now, as for Keona's mother, she's not happy with the sentence that Kayla was given. She doesn't think it's enough time, but she feels like she needs to move towards some closure. Her daughter is gone. There's nothing she can do about that, but she still has to live for her other kids and for her grandchildren. So she needs to just try to let it go, which seems like an impossible task, but we do see people do it. I just will never understand how they have the strength to do so. When asked what she would like to say to Kayla if she was able to do so, Keona's mother said, quote, "I would say to her to give her life to the Lord and ask God to forgive her. God is the only one that can save you at this time." Now, as for Kayla's daughter, because remember, she had a young daughter named Michaela at the time that she was arrested, everything I see says that she's living with Kenny now and that she's living a wonderful life. And as it comes to Kenny, it doesn't seem like he was involved at all, but I kind of couldn't get a strong handle based on the articles I read what Keona's family thinks about him. Some family members seem to say that he loved Keona and that he had expressed his apologies for what happened to her and like he was heartbroken over what happened. But some things I saw online said that it seemed like perhaps he had been playing both women a little bit and hooking up with both women while he was with Keona. I don't know if that's true. I have a little bit of an opinion. I'm sure you can guess what it is, but I don't know. I don't know him. All I know for sure is that he was determined not to have been involved in Keona's murder, and I would say the fact that Kayla tried to have him murdered shows that that's probably true. Now, as for Kayla herself, she is still in jail, and she actually has a profile page on a website called CagedLadies.com, which I did not realize was a thing. It's just like Write a Prisoner, which you guys know I fucking love Write a Prisoner. I don't. I think it's stupid, and I don't think you should have that right, but this website seems to be the same kind of thing, but for women specifically. And her profile page says, quote, "Hey, my name is Kayla. I have a great personality with a lot of assets, if you know what I mean. I want a friend that wants something different in a woman and wants to have a great conversation. I like to exercise, watch old movies, listen to music, and spend time with those I care about. I have 2 degrees in business management and paralegal studies. In my spare time, I write business plans for different projects I want to work on when I get home." So that's something, I guess. At least she gets to go home. Keona doesn't get to go home. I don't get people, man. She murdered this woman. She stole her future. She stole her baby's future. She ruined her own life. She ruined her daughter's life. She ruined the lives of everyone who loved Keona. And for what? Nothing. And now because of her, all Keona's mother has left is a large photo of her on her wall. And every day she looks at this photo and she tells her murdered daughter that she loves her. Gather around and let me tell you the story of the disappearance of Heather Elvis. On December 17th, 2013, 20-year-old Heather Elvis, who is from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, went on a first date with a new man. You see, this date was kind of her trying to dip her toe into the dating scene because just a couple of months earlier she had been dumped, and it was a pretty nasty breakup, and she had been having a lot of trouble with it. It was a lot of drama, as you know, those things can sometimes be. So she was just trying to do what she could do to get herself back out there, get her heart in a good place. So she linked up with a guy that I believe she had gone to high school with, and they went on a little date. It was a good time, and she had just gotten home. Heather was dropped off at a little after 1 a.m. and shortly thereafter she called her roommate, a girl named Brianna, and she called her just crying hysterically. Heather was very upset. So her and her roommate talked for about 10 minutes. Her roommate Brianna told her, you know, keep your head up, sleep it off, don't do anything rash. We'll talk tomorrow and, you know, make some good decisions regarding what you're so upset about. And the two hung up. And this would be the last time that Brianna would ever talk to her roommate and friend, Heather Elvis. Now, who was Heather Elvis? Heather Elvis was born to parents Terry Elvis and Debbie Elvis on June 30th, 1993, making her a Cancer. By all accounts, Heather was just known as being a good person, a helpful person, a friendly person. She was active in her church in her younger years, even volunteering at a church daycare during services, and while on a missionary trip to Costa Rica, she worked with children there as well. Heather was the type of person who just made you smile. She was that person that just lit up a room whenever she walked in. She was a happy person who had always been strong and decisive in her decision making. She came from a tight-knit family, very close and in constant communication. She was an outgoing, free-spirited girl with dreams and ambitions and the drive to actually go after what it was that she wanted. Whatever it was that she wanted. Heather, as she was growing up, was aspiring to be a makeup artist and also a model. She loved being in front of the camera and behind the camera, creating the looks. Heather graduated from St. James High School in South Carolina in 2011, and shortly thereafter, like many beautiful women, she wanted to follow her passion in beauty and makeup and started studying cosmetology, which is honestly not an easy thing to do. This is the job and a career that takes a lot of passion and energy and determination, but Heather did possess all of those qualities. To help make ends meet and to have a little extra money during her classes, Heather actually got a job at a local pub. I don't think it's only local to that area, but it was a pub that was in her area called the Tilted Kilt. And this was like a place where you could go get drinks, get bar food, and the girls, the waitresses and the hostesses were dressed in like hot little outfits with like little plaid skirts and little plaid bra. It was like a Scottish Hooters. And it was while working at the Tilted Kilt that in June of 2013, Heather would meet a man who she would become completely enamored with. This was a man named Sidney Moore. Now, Sidney Moore was a maintenance worker who would come into her business, and he was like an independent contractor who would come in to service kitchen equipment, anything that was broken in the restaurant. He would come in and he would fix. And one day when he came in, Heather saw him and she looked at him and she looked at her friends and she was like, dibs, that one is mine. Now, the thing is that Heather was 20. And Sidney was 37, but the age difference did not seem to bother her because she immediately was like, that is mine, don't touch that, and immediately developed a pretty big crush on him. She made a lot of jokes to her friends and also online about liking older men and about how, you know, the guy who fixed things at her work made her cream her jeans and how she wanted to rape him. And these statements to my 32-year-old ears are like, not so much, but I know without question that 20-year-old Brittany said the same kind of dumb shit. Heather was just a super blunt person, maybe even a little bit abrasive to some people, but she was just that person who had no problem saying exactly what she felt, exactly when she felt it to your face, and was unapologetically honest. And clearly Sidney didn't mind that Heather was a bit younger and maybe said some immature things here and there, because he definitely encouraged and nurtured this behavior. In early July of 2013, Heather tweeted of her infatuation with said Sidney Moore, saying, and I quote, "One of these days, I will drag that man into a mop closet and have my way with him. Lord have mercy." So apparently Sidney just had, you know, his dick danced, okay? I've seen photos. I don't personally get it, but you know, the heart wants what the heart wants. Now, there was only one problem with Heather and Sidney's budding and beautiful workplace romance. And that is that Sidney was not a single man. Sidney had a wife named Tammy back at home, whom he'd been married to for nearly 2 decades, and the two had 3 children together, ranging in ages of 10 to 15. And the couple and their family were known as being like a really close, tight-knit family. Both Sidney and Tammy worked the night shift, so they would have the same schedule where they'd sleep a lot during the day and spend time together during the night. They were always together. They were also the type of parents, that sounds judgy, I don't mean that to sound judgy. They also homeschooled their children, so they were just always together, very involved in each other's lives, and seen as like a really good, happy, stable family. Even with this information, you know, this little fact that Sidney had a wife and a family looming over the two, they still chose to engage in a romantic affair. And they were pretty obsessed with each other during this time. Sidney started coming into the Tilted Kilt even when he wasn't working there, just so he could bring her coffee, bring Heather coffee, bring Heather breakfast, just to spend time with her. And when they weren't together physically, they were always texting and talking on the phone. They were just in constant communication. And from the outside, to most people, this relationship looked to just be a fling, pretty physical, pretty sexual. But according to Heather, when she would talk to her friends about it, she said that her and Sidney were in love. So to her, it was more serious than that. This relationship did not last long, however, because only a couple months after it began, in October of 2013, Sidney's wife Tammy found out about the relationship, and she shut that shit down real quick. Tammy was super pissed, and she started constantly calling and texting Heather, saying some not so nice words. She also made Sidney call Heather, I believe in front of her, if I remember correctly, and break the relationship off. And he said some pretty horrible things to her, telling her that she was nothing. She was just like a slut and whore and just a fling, just a girl who spread her legs for him, which I'm sure was just devastating to hear because she was thinking that these two were in love. And in addition to this being devastating for Heather, I'm sure it was also devastating for Tammy because, like, this is your husband, right? And not only, okay, drama. Not only had Tammy and Sydney been together for years and years and years, and they were so close and she trusted him, this also wasn't Sydney's first affair. Apparently, he had been unfaithful to Tammy at least on one other occasion, and I can't imagine how frustrating that would be to be with a man all these years, have him be an unfaithful piece of shit. Then you forgive him, take him back, learn to trust him again, just to find out that he cheated on you again, and with a woman half your age. A woman barely older than your eldest child. That's a lot. Now, Tammy, okay. Even though Sydney ended the relationship with Heather, this did not seem to satisfy Tammy. Tammy really went out there doing the most. And now here's the thing. Here's my take on this. Infidelity happens. I'm not saying it should. I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying that it happens, right? And I'm of the opinion that if you're going to choose to stay with a person who was unfaithful to you, you have to do so with forgiveness, with trust building, with communication. You know what I mean? You have to let that go and build from it in order to stay together and have any sort of good relationship, right? That's not exactly how these two approached the affair. Tammy did the most. Okay, she did not trust Sydney at all, and she really just went all out. She would not let Sydney out of her sight. She put a password on his cell phone that he did not have. So if he needed to use his phone for any reason, he would have to have her put in the password on his phone, which you would think would be very inconvenient for him while he's out doing his job. You know, he owns his company, he's out going to the restaurants, fixing the things. But the thing is this wasn't that inconvenient because Tammy went everywhere with him, even for work. In addition to this, at night, okay, to ensure that Sydney could not leave the house while she was sleeping, and she would handcuff him to their marital bed, which is crazy and also symbolic. And to sort of mark her territory, or to literally, I was gonna say figuratively, but to literally mark her territory, she had Sydney get a tattoo of her name, Tammy, right above his ween. You can't make these things up. And also during the trial, which you can watch some of it on YouTube if you would like to, one of Tammy and Sydney's son's friends testified at trial saying that he heard Tammy tell Sydney, and I quote here loosely, that this wouldn't be happening if you hadn't went around messing with that girl, and she was referring to the tattoo. So now things were pretty rough for Heather initially when the relationship first ended with Sydney, because like she really liked him, you know, she thought that they had something special. She thought that this was like something more than apparently he thought it was, and to have it end so abruptly and for him to be such a dick about it, and then for him to tell her that she was like nothing, and then to have his wife like freaking harassing her, calling her over and over, this was just like a really difficult time for Heather and in Heather's life, and at such a young age. It just got Heather pretty down. And plus she was like legitimately scared of Tammy because Tammy was harassing her. She was texting her over and over saying things like, "Hey, sweetie, you want to meet the missus now?" Which was meant to be like, you know, like, let's fight. And to continue threatening her, she would text her like, "Oh, someone's going to get a beat down." And she would tell her like that she was even going to kill Sydney. She was just being a lot. And then she would even send videos and photos of her, Tammy, and Sydney in like sexual acts. She was just doing a lot. And at one point, Heather was just like, "Bro, please, can you just stop? Like, I don't want him. You won. You got him. Take him. Have him. I don't care. Just please leave me alone." And eventually, Tammy did stop texting Heather. In September of 2013, Heather tweeted of her relationship with Sydney, or at least it's believed that it's of her relationship with Sydney. It seems to, you know, correlate in timing and everything. And she tweeted, and I quote, "Once upon a time, an angel and a devil fell in love. It did not end well." Shortly after this, Sydney and Tammy actually went on a cross-country family road trip to sort of try to rekindle their relationship, try to heal from the infidelity. And of course, Heather heard about this, and it was hard for her. It was hard for her to accept that it was over, that he was moving on past her and staying with his wife. And she took this time, though, as an opportunity to rebuild, to try to like get everything back on track, to try to get happy again, and could now do so without the harassment from Tammy, because they were gone and they were distracted for one moment, not thinking about Heather. By December, this seemed to be really effective. She seemed to be doing a lot better. She seemed to have been over Sydney. She hadn't called him in ages. She was back hanging out with her friends, starting to date. She was just like getting on with her life, being like a normal 20-year-old single lady. So now we're back in December. We're back to the night that Heather disappeared. So as I said before, she had gone out on a first date with a guy that she knew from high school, and it seemed to have gone pretty well. The two went to dinner, and then they went to a parking lot where he let her practice driving his truck so that she could learn to drive stick shift. This was really exciting for Heather because driving stick was actually something that she had always wanted to learn since she was a little girl. She wanted to master this skill, so she was so stoked that she actually had this guy take a photo of her driving his truck, and then she sent this both to her best friend, the one that she lived with, and to her father, and just saying like, oh look, I'm so great now at driving stick. And her dad said in an interview that this was both like something that made him proud because he had always tried to teach her to drive stick, but it was also like a playful jab because anytime he did take her out to try, she wasn't especially receptive, but now she was like on a date with some guy and was learning. So he was like, it was just notable to him. After the date, Heather was dropped off at her apartment alone because her roommate, the one that she had sent the photo to, I'm 99% sure it was the same person, was out of town because it was December, it was the holidays. And this is when, at about 1:35 a.m., Heather received a call from Sydney, which she took. Now, we don't know exactly what was said on this call, but the call lasted about 10 minutes. It was after this that Heather called her roommate and called her really upset, telling her that she had received the call from Sydney and she didn't know what to do. Sydney had told her that he loved her, that he missed her, that he wanted her back, that he was leaving his wife, and Heather, who had been working so hard at getting over Sydney, was distraught, not knowing what to do with this situation. Her friend and roommate did not like this because she didn't like Sydney. She didn't like the drama he brought to Heather's life, and he was just like not a good guy, right? So she reminded Heather like, yo, look at how much better your life has been since he's been out of it. Look at how much drama he brought to your life. Like, don't be stupid. Let's think this through. Heather then promised that she wasn't going to do anything crazy. She was going to sleep on it, gather her thoughts before she contacted Sydney, and she wasn't gonna like see him. Satisfied, you know, her and her friend got off the phone, and this was the last time that Brianna would ever speak to her. This is the last time that anyone who really cared about Heather would ever speak to her again. On December 19th, Heather's car was found abandoned at this place called Peachtree Landing. Now, apparently, an officer had actually seen Heather's car at this location the night before, the night that she actually went missing, at about 4 a.m., but he didn't think much of it. He thought it was kind of weird that it was sitting there, but figured whoever it was going to come back for it, and it only became a cause for concern when the following day it was still there. So police run whatever they run. I'm not a policeman. And they find that the car is registered to Terry Elvis, which is Heather's dad. So they go on over, they knock on the door, they're like, hey, are you, missing a car? And they're like, look in their driveway, they're like, no, what? And so the officer describes the car to, Terry and Terry's wife, and he's like, oh shit, like that's Heather's car. So police actually take Heather's dad to the area where the car was abandoned. They get there, he uses his spare key to unlock the car, and they have him look around, and he looks in it and he sees that nothing looks out of the ordinary. He does still think it's very odd that the car would be left in this area in the first place, but He's like, nothing looks missing, nothing looks off, this looks like how Heather keeps her car. So police, not expecting at the time that a crime was committed, actually let Terry get in the car and drive the car home. Police did follow him so that they could discuss further, so it's not like he was like given the car where he could do anything to it, but he was like in it, and if it was a crime scene, that's like contamination, you know what I mean? I'm not sure why police didn't keep the car as evidence and didn't think immediately that it was a crime scene. I mean, at this point, it doesn't matter. We can't really check the car and see if it had any evidence. It's all contaminated anyway, but like, just the fact that the car was at Peachtree Landing, I looked into it, and this is just a place where you go to put boats in the water. That's like its literal only purpose. So there's no real reason for Heather to have been there. And it's not like her car broke down or anything. They checked it. The car was in good and working order. It's just like she went there and vanished. Anyways, police, as I said, followed Heather's dad home. And when they got there, he was able to give them access to Heather's phone records because he actually still paid Heather's phone bill. So police could start mapping out her final, like her last steps when anybody saw her. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? So police start searching the area of Peachtree Lane. They start searching directly around the car and then the surrounding areas, and they keep kind of moving their search further out, and they realize as the days turn into weeks and the weeks turn into months that this is obviously a much more serious situation because Heather is nowhere to be found. She just dropped off the map. Police investigated the 21-year-old man who Heather had gone on a date with that night because, you know, last person to see her alive as far as they know. Romantic interest, you know the gist. And they questioned him, and his story seemed to line up pretty well. Like, there was no inconsistencies. He says that they went to dinner before they went to the Kmart parking lot where he showed her how to drive the stick shift. He says that they went back to his house that he shared with his mother, and they watched a movie, and his mom corroborated this. And then he just dropped her off back at home. Police didn't really consider him to be a serious suspect, so they decided, okay, let's go to her work. Let's talk to the people she worked with. Let's see if she missed any shifts, if anything was going on. See if anyone there is willing to talk to us. And when they did that, that's where they first learned the name Sydney Moore and learned that with the history, he would definitely be somebody worth investigating. So police questioned Sydney, right? And they ask him, like, where were you the night that Heather Elvis disappeared? And he tells police that he was with his wife the whole night. They were running errands, and then they went home and they spent time together. He had an alibi for the whole night. He was with his wife. They were being in love, right? So they ask him if he called Heather that night, because you remember Heather called her roommate and said that, you know, Sydney had called her, right? And he says no. And the reason the police could not determine for sure whether or not it had been Sydney who called, even though they had, you know, Heather's phone records, is because Heather had received a call that night, but it was from a payphone, not from Sydney's own phone. So police ask him, like, did you call her from a payphone? And he's like, oh, what, a payphone? People still use those things? Weird. And completely denied it. So now, let's go back just a little bit to the night that Heather disappeared, because police have Heather's phone records, and then they end up getting Sydney's phone records, and they're able to piece together basically a timeline of what they believe happened to Heather. So you remember how I told you that Heather called her roommate the night she disappeared, really upset, saying she talked to Sydney, and this was a little bit after 1 a.m., right? Well, after this call, Heather tried to call Sydney back over and over, not to his cell phone yet, but to that payphone that she had received the call from, but got no answer because he probably left because it's a payphone. But that's just me speculating, I guess. I don't know. No, I don't think I am. I think that's what happened. Anyway, I guess that's the definition of speculation, but whatever. So she tried to call him several times and was not able to get a hold of him, so then she started calling his cell phone. A couple of times these went unanswered as well, but eventually they did connect at about 3 a.m. They talked for a couple of minutes. We don't know what was said, but right after she got off the phone with him, she left her house, got in her car, and headed towards Peachtree Landing. Now, I just realized that I don't think I've even told you what Peachtree Landing is. Peachtree Landing is a small rural boat landing that's set on an undeveloped area of the Waccamaw River. So that's where she headed off into the night after talking to Sydney Moore. She does appear to have made it to Peachtree Landing according to her cell phone records. Shortly after this, a vehicle that matches the vehicle that Sydney Moore drove. It was a black F-150 truck, I believe. I don't know a lot about cars, but I'm pretty sure that's what it was. A neighbor's surveillance camera sees a car that resembles Sydney's leaving from the direction of Sydney's house, headed towards Peachtree Landing. I do not believe there was any cell records to show that it was actually him, just for, you know, clarity. Because, you know, there's a good chance that his cell phone was turned off or left at home because, you know, we find later that some efforts were taken to conceal some information here, but either way, just a thought. And also, from what I remember, I watched a documentary on this, from what I remember hearing, I'm pretty sure there were no other trucks like that in that area. Like, no one who lived over there owned a truck like that except for Sydney and his wife. Anyways, shortly after seeing this truck drive over to Peachtree Landing area, Heather's phone, that's it. It goes dark. Whether it died or it was turned off, probably turned off. There was no more data coming from Heather's phone ever again after that. Shortly after Heather's phone goes dark, the truck that had been seen going from Sydney's area to Peachtree Landing was then seen leaving Peachtree Landing, heading back towards the area of Sydney's home. Now, apparently this all happened very quickly, according to the cameras and the timeline. The truck appeared on camera to be driving the speed limit, so what would have had to have happened here if it was Sydney who picked up Heather was that he got there, was like, hey, come on, let's go. She immediately jumped in his car and they immediately drove off, heading back towards his house because everything happened incredibly quickly. Back to when Sydney's being questioned by police. They ask him if it was him who made this phone call from the payphone, and he flat out denies it. But police are not dumb. They had already looked into the surveillance videos and had already seen that, yes, Sydney, it was you making the call to Heather on this payphone. So you're lying, bro. Why would you do that? It's a weird thing to do if you are not innocent, if you are not guilty of doing something. Police were actually able to determine that not only was Sydney there while that phone call was being made, like he was seen on camera making the call from the payphone, but according to their cell phone records, Tammy was there also. Tammy and him drove up together. They parked, he got out, he ran over, he made the phone call. So she was there as well, which is a little bit odd. And after he was confronted with the evidence that, like, yo, we know that it was you, he was like, okay, yes, I called her, but I was just telling her to leave me and my family alone. Even though at this point, she had been leaving you and your family alone, she hadn't contacted him in quite some time, so that didn't really seem to make sense. But this is what he was saying upon being confronted with being a liar. It took until February of the following year for a search warrant to be requested and signed off by a judge for the police to search the home that Sydney shared with his wife and children. And once it was signed off and they went and searched that house, they definitely found some stuff that kind of got their laser beams. It piqued their interest and it made them think that they were definitely on the right track, is what I was trying to say, but I forgot how to speak English, so. Police, in addition to searching the home that the two shared, were able to search the truck. And when they searched the truck, they found that the truck had a GPS system that was installed in it. And they were like, yes, perfect, wonderful, whatever is on here is going to give us the smoking gun we need. But it actually turned out that what was not present on the GPS would end up being helpful for them. Because you see, this GPS was hooked up in such a way that you could remove it. Okay, and if you removed it, obviously it wasn't going to be tracking. So they looked into this, they investigated it, and in looking into it, they found that since the couple got their vehicle, every single day had been accounted for on that GPS. Every time of day, it was always plugged in. It had only been unplugged one time. And when you unplug it, it's not like something you could do on accident. When you did it, like the screen's lit up with like things letting you know, like, hey, it's not working, it's not working. It was like a fasten your seatbelt thing. Like, it's very clear. So you would have done this on purpose or known that it was happening. And when they looked into it, the only time that was unaccounted for was the time that Heather Elvis went missing. That same day, Sydney was arrested. But not just Sydney. Sydney and his wife Tammy were arrested, and they were both charged with the kidnapping and murder of Heather Elvis. Now, I had to look into this because I was like, kidnapping, it's a bit weird, but apparently in South Carolina, for something to be considered kidnapping, it's not just forcibly moving one person from one place to another place. Apparently, if you employ a decoy to get somebody out of the house, that could get you charged with kidnapping. And by Sydney calling Heather to lure her out of the house and into a trap in order to get her away, that was considered kidnapping. Both Tammy and Sydney were held in jail without bond for 12 months, and then for some reason after that period of time, the judge decided to give them bond of $100,000 apiece, which they both did post, and then they were able to be released until their trials were heard, but they had to wear ankle monitors. Now, get this. This is absolutely crazy to me. Once they were released out on bond, they asked the judge for permission to move out of state because apparently Sydney wasn't able to get any work because he was, a suspected murderer. So the judge actually signed off on this, and the two were able to move to Florida. They were able to leave the state and move to Florida and just live their lives in Florida. And I just thought that was kind of crazy that they let them leave the state when they were, being investigated and being put on trial for kidnapping and murder. But okay. Now, this case took a while to get to trial, which is common but discouraging, but it did. And by the time it actually got to trial, the murder charges against Sydney and Tammy were dropped because the prosecution felt that they didn't have enough to actually secure a murder conviction. They had no body, they had no evidence, they had no blood, they had no weapon, they had nothing to even prove a murder had been committed, though circumstantial evidence was strong, but they did think they had enough to get them on kidnapping. So the murder charges were dropped and they were just being brought up on kidnapping charges. In June of 2016, so 2.5 years after Heather Elvis went missing, Sydney's trial began. And it was while at Sydney's trial that a bomb was dropped that could definitely help prove motive in this case. You see, here's what happened. Several witnesses came forward at Sydney's trial that testified that Heather was most likely pregnant at the time that she disappeared. And when people testified against this, they also testified that the only person that they knew Heather was in a relationship was Sydney's, which meant if she was pregnant, it was most likely Sydney's child. Of these witnesses, one was a friend and coworker from the Tilted Kilt who testified that Heather had gained a pretty good amount of weight in the months following her relationship with Sydney, and that she knew for a fact Heather had taken a pregnancy test during that time. Another person was her boss at the Tilted Kilt, and they said that Heather went up several sizes in both her bra and her skirt preceding the months that she had been in a relationship with Sydney. Due to her gaining weight, and that she, I think the boss was a woman, yeah, the boss was a woman, that she had received a call from Sydney's wife, Tammy, telling her to fire Heather. Tammy was telling Heather's boss to fire Heather because Heather was a whore and a bitch and was going around telling people that she was pregnant with Sydney's baby and ruining their lives and their relationship, and that if they would not fire Heather, that Sydney was no longer going to do work for them, which is a very professional thing that she did, might I say. And last and most damning when combined with the previous testimony that I've just given you, it was found that Sydney, the night that Heather disappeared, the night, like right before he called Heather on that payphone, Sydney drove to a Walmart where he parked in a handicap spot because he's a dick. He went into the Walmart and guess what he purchased? A pregnancy test. And then he went outside, got in his car, and him and his wife drove to a payphone where they called Heather. He explained this away saying that him and his wife were trying to get pregnant. Timing seems a bit fucking weird. No? 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 Yeah. The prosecution did only have circumstantial evidence, but the circumstantial evidence they had really told a story from Sydney and his wife getting in the car, driving to Walmart, buying a pregnancy test, then driving straight to a payphone, calling Heather. Right after calling Heather, they're seen leaving their home. They went home. They're seen leaving their home, headed toward, well, their vehicle is seen leaving their home, headed towards Peachtree Landing. Right after Heather's phone goes dead completely, their vehicle is seen headed from Peachtree Landing right back to their home. Though it's circumstantial evidence is incredibly useful in telling a story, and a lot of criminal cases are solved with circumstantial evidence. And when you consider what he bought at Walmart and the fact that a lot of people thought that Heather was pregnant, it definitely helps provide a motive. And you don't actually need a motive in criminal cases. I don't know if everybody knows that. That's not one of the things that you need to prove in order to convict somebody. But with a jury, it definitely helps to know why. Though Heather's family and the prosecution believed that they had a slam dunk of a case, Sidney's trial actually ended up having a hung jury where 10 people thought he was guilty, even without a body. They thought he was guilty, but 2 people were not sure. So it was a mistrial and he would have to be retried. He did, however, get brought up on charges for obstruction of justice because of him lying to police in the first place and saying that he hadn't talked to Heather on the payphone, which he ended up getting 10 years for. The jury only deliberated for like 1 hour on that. They came out and they gave him 10 years, so he still went to jail. So Tammy's trial was next and it was set to begin in October of 2018, but the prosecution was worried that they weren't going to get a conviction on Tammy because they hadn't gotten a conviction on Sidney, and there was a clear link between Sidney and Heather, but not really so much of a link between Heather and Tammy. And they also really wanted a conviction on Tammy, among other reasons, because they believed that if Tammy was found guilty for this, it would be a lot easier when retrying Sidney for this crime. So at this point, they decided to sort of like broaden their timeline with police. And instead of just looking at the night that Heather disappeared, they started looking at the weeks and the months leading up to it. And they found through GPS records, through phone records, that Tammy and Sidney had actually been stalking Heather prior to her disappearance. Like for a while. They started in November. They started following her around everywhere without her knowing. This is when they were also able to determine through the phone records that Tammy was with Sidney the night that Heather disappeared. So from all of this, they were able to add conspiracy to commit kidnapping to Tammy's charges in addition with just kidnapping itself. So they had double on her. They had extra stuff on her. And I think they were able to put conspiracy on Sidney when they retried him as well, actually. Tammy chose to testify at her own trial, and Heather's father said that every time he heard Tammy use his daughter's name, it was like he was being stabbed in the chest. Tammy smiled and tried to seem charming up on a stage, which just seemed incredibly off-putting. And when she was asked if she kidnapped Heather, if she knew who did, or if she knew if it even happened, she kept like looking away while answering these questions. She'd look completely over here, like the attorney was here. He'd ask the question, and she'd look over here while answering, saying no to all of them, and only look back at them once those questions were done. In the end, after 4 hours of deliberation, Tammy was found guilty of the kidnapping of Heather Elvis and given 30 years in prison for the crime. So while all of this is happening, Sidney has been in jail all this time, serving his 10 years for obstruction of justice. And in 2019, his second trial for the kidnapping of Heather Elvis began, because remember, his first one ended in a mistrial. During this trial, even more damning evidence came out about the couple. You see, within a couple of days after Heather went missing on December 22nd, there is footage that shows Sidney and Tammy deep cleaning their truck. The same truck that was seen on surveillance going to and from Peachtree Landing. And not just like light cleaning, like deep cleaning. Like they really went in for hours cleaning this truck, and they took special care on the front passenger side of the vehicle. If that isn't weird enough, after they finished cleaning the vehicle, they took the cleaning supplies, like the rags and stuff, and they put them in a pile and they set them on fire, which is a totally normal thing to do. In addition to that, they had a new witness to testify against Sidney at his trial this time. This was a man named Donald. Now, Donald at the time of his testimony was an inmate. He was in prison, and he had been in jail, you know, in and out for burglary and for drugs. But at the time that Heather went missing, he was out of jail, and he gave some pretty shocking testimony against Sidney at his trial. So Donald was Tammy's cousin, by the way. I don't think I mentioned that. Donald was Tammy's cousin. He said that back in 2014, after Heather had gone missing, Sidney had shown him a really eerie photo on his cell phone. He said that it was a photo of Heather Elvis, that she clearly was not taking this photo voluntarily, that she appeared to be dead, and that she had blood on her shirt and cuts on her face. With this information, the jury deliberated for only 2 hours this time and came back and gave him the same verdict that was bestowed upon his wife. He was found guilty of the kidnapping of Heather Elvis, and he too was given 30 years in prison. And sadly, that is where we're left. Neither Tammy nor Sydney have given any additional information, and they both say that there is no additional information for them to give. Sydney says that he wishes he could give Heather's family closure because he has kids and he knows what it's like, but that he has no information to give them. But to me, that kind of sounds like bullshit. The main theory here is pretty obvious, right? That Sydney and Tammy lured Heather into a trap. They abducted her and they ended up killing her. I mean, they were found guilty of kidnapping her, right? And then she just was never seen alive again. So what else happened to her? The two took the time to follow her, to stalk her. Tammy harassed her. She was pissed. And you know what? Sydney was probably pissed too, because there was now so much drama in his life and he probably didn't take any personal responsibility for it and saw Heather as the issue that just needed to be resolved. And man, if Heather was pregnant, that just adds a whole new level to this, because like maybe you can forgive your partner for cheating because you guys can just forget about this person, move on with your life. But if Heather was pregnant, Heather would always be in their life to some extent because she'd have his child, and that just might have been more than the two thought they could overcome. And like, I do understand that it's hard to solve and prove a murder with no body, but truly, what else could have happened? It seems so obvious and so right in your face, but yet nothing's being done, and that's really frustrating. People are definitely holding out hope that once Sydney and Tammy exhaust their appeals, that with the realization that 30 years is a long ass time and them having some space between the two of them, that maybe they'll turn on each other to try to get a plea deal, or not a plea deal, but try to get a deal to get out of prison sooner so that they can go on with their lives and be with their kids. But that's like the only thing that I could see bringing closure to this case, because unless they find Heather's body, I don't really see how else it can move forward, and that's just got to be very difficult for her family to know. And now let's just get into discussing the Texas cadet murder. So this story is on the tragic murder of Adrienne Jones. So Adrienne Jones, who her family called AJ, was a 16-year-old sophomore at Mansfield High in 1995. Adrienne was a really friendly girl, popular, easy to get along with. One of her former teachers described her as sort of a cheerleader type, that kind of personality, that kind of energy. She was pretty, she cared about her appearance, liked to wear makeup to school, you know, like we all do, obviously. But she was also sporty, and she was on her high school, Mansfield High's track team. Unfortunately, there's not that much information on Adrienne out there, as her life was tragically cut short at 16 in what the media dubbed a deadly love triangle. So in 1995, David Graham, who was 17 or 18 at the time, I couldn't find for sure because I couldn't find his birthday online, and his girlfriend Diane Zamora, who was 17 at the time, started dating. And this was in 1995, the same year that this whole story takes place. Immediately, it was intense. Like right off the bat, it was super intense, and within a month, they had announced their engagement to their families. People would describe the couple who knew them as being a little obsessed with each other to the point that it was unhealthy, and in David's own words, he was infatuated with her and she was obsessed with him. So the couple had planned to marry in the year 2000 once they had both finished their respective military academy training, because you see, David and Diane were both really interested in joining the military. So Diane was a sophomore honors student at her high school, which was Crowley High, which is different than the school that David went to, and she was going to be joining the Naval Academy with hopes of one day being an astronaut. Dream big. And David was a track star at Mansfield High. remember, the same school that Adrian went to, and he had the dreams of becoming a pilot. That was like all he cared about, was becoming a pilot. The couple's interest in the military is actually how they met in 1991. They were both volunteering in this program called the Texas Civil Air Patrol, which essentially taught them the basics in everyday life of being in the military. And this was a weekly thing that they both went to. It's unclear what happened between 1991 and 1995 when they finally got together, but all that we do know for sure is that once they got together, it was hot and intense, and described by them and by Diane as untouchable and a different type of love than anyone had ever felt in life. But unfortunately, one night in late November or early December, this idea of the perfect love that Diana thought that her and David had was shattered, because David confessed to her that he had cheated on her with a fellow member of his track meet named Adrian Jones. So David said that one night, no, it was not one night, November 4th specifically, after a track meet, Adrian had asked for a ride home, and instead of going straight home, they took a detour that led them to park behind the elementary school, I don't know which one, and they had sex in his car. So Diane did not take this well. It destroyed her. I read in her confession, which she later gave, which was so long. I read both hers and David's confessions to kind of, you know, compare their accounts of the night. She said that she was slamming her head into the wall and into the floor trying to crack her skull. She said that she just kept screaming at David, "Kill her, kill her." So the couple decided, and this is in David's own words, so let me read it out loud to you. "When this precious relationship was damaged by my thoughtless actions, the only thing that could satisfy her womanly vengeance was the life of the one that had, for an instant, taken her place." So, on December 3rd, 1995, at about 10:30 p.m., David called Adrian Jones on the phone. And even though her mom said that her normal phone curfew was 10 p.m., there's a hair, excuse me, she did allow Adrian to take the phone call. David then arranged a date with her for that night where he would pick her up and she'd sneak out of her house. And the timeline on it was a little weird in both of their confessions. One said 12:30, one said like 1 a.m. So we're gonna say between midnight and 1 a.m. he was gonna be picking her up. So Adrian snuck out of her house to go meet David, and he picked her up in Diane's car, where Diane was hiding in the trunk of like the car. Duh. and then David drove her and him and all of them to a deserted road near Grand Prairie, Texas. So apparently the initial plan that the couple had was to have Diane sneak out of the trunk, because there was like a latch where she could push the back seat back, and she would go up behind Adrian and snap her neck the way, you know, you see people do in movies, and then they would attach weights to her body and weigh her down in a lake. Unfortunately for them, I guess, when the attack actually took place, things did not go as expected for them. So apparently after they parked, Diane waited a little bit, and then she pushed the seat back to kind of look out and see if it was the right time for them to begin. And when she looked out, Adrian had already had her seat reclined back, and David was sort of leaning over her like he was gonna kiss her. And this enraged Diane, obviously. I think personally it's because when she saw that, it was sort of like a picture in her mind of what happened previously. Like, this is what it looked like, and it, you know, hit her there. He then waved Diane out, and she crawled out, and she attempted to snap Adrian's neck, but she realized that it's a lot more difficult than they make it look in the movies, obviously. Diane, you little 17-year-old girl. So at this time, David and Adrian started to struggle in the front seat, and Diane said that she was worried that Adrian was going to hurt David, so she grabbed one of the weights that they were planning on weighing her down with, and she smashed it into Adrian's head. So it's unclear how, but the couple says that Adrian was able to escape the car through the open window, I'm assuming on the passenger side. And she started to run out into a field. And Diane said to David, "We can't let her get away." So David gets out of the car and follows her into the field, where she had collapsed into a barbed wire fence due to her head injury. David had said he realized that he couldn't leave the one witness to their crime alive, and that it felt like it was her or them, and he shot young Adrian twice in the head. And then they left her in the field. The couple reports that their first words to each other when they took off and left Adrian in the field was, "I love you," to one another. And then David says that Diane said, "We shouldn't have done that, David." Duh. So that night they actually went to a friend's house to clean up. So they went to a friend's house. They then disposed of their clothes, cleaned out their car, and fell asleep together by a fireplace. They said that they were having a lot of trouble with it, and that they felt a lot of regret and guilt immediately, but that's what they did. And the friend never said anything, which is weird, because you would think he would be like, "Oh, they came to my house and they had blood on them," because they would, because they murdered somebody. And then the next day they find a body of a teenage girl, and you know, sure. And with that said, the next day, Adrian's body was found by a farmer in the field, badly beaten and shot, but the case went cold for 9 months. So during those 9 months, David and Diane had left to their respective military academies. Diane was at a naval academy in Maryland, and David was at an Air Force academy in Colorado. Now, I'm not sure why. It may have been the guilt getting to Diane, or it may be that she just wanted to brag about how strong her love with her long distance fiance was, but Diane started to brag and tell people about the murder. She told at least 2 classmates that we know of, and one of those classmates went and reported it to the supervisors at the Naval Academy. So this was in 1996, and obviously that information got back to police in their hometown in Texas, right? Texas, yeah. And police then went and questioned Diane, which she denied everything. But even though she denied everything, she was suspended from the Naval Academy pending the investigation. And shortly after that, David was brought in for questioning and giving a polygraph test, which he failed, and he then confessed, and he gave a written confession. 2 days later, Diane was also arrested, and they showed her that David had confessed, and she saw like his signature on the confession, and so she then confessed as well. So initially, Diane, her story lined up with David's pretty perfectly, with her taking the blame for both striking Adrian in the head and suggesting that they kill her in the first place. But over time, she started to change her story, and so did David. The perfect couple had started to turn on each other, because of course they did. Diane started telling police that she never actually intended to hurt Adrian. She just wanted to meet her because she thought that David was lying about the affair to make her jealous. Okay. She also stated that she initially gave the confession she did because she loved Graham, and she was also afraid of him, and she wanted to try to help protect his military career. She claimed that he was physically abusive, and she was afraid that he would kill her if she didn't go along. I don't really believe this myself. It's just my opinion, but without Diane's jealousy, I don't really see what the motive would be here for them to do this at all. That's what I'm thinking. Additionally, the details from Diane's initial confession line up with all of the injuries on Adrian's body and all of the evidence they had at the crime scene. And last, witnesses who Diane had confessed this to, the people at her naval base, said that she was not apologetic. She referred to Adrian as a tramp and said that she would kill her again if she had the chance. So this doesn't sound like somebody who wasn't involved to me. Some jurors were actually swayed by Diane's little pity party story. A few felt that she wasn't guilty of the murder, but just as an accomplice to David. But due to the Texas law of parties, any accomplices to a crime like murder have to be sentenced as if they had committed the murder themselves. And this law I find very interesting because I had never heard about it before until recently, because I've been looking into the case from Ohio, the Dylan Groves case, the case where the parents killed their little baby. I don't know if you've heard about this. I'm looking into doing a video on it. It's really, really sad. But in that case, they had the same type of law that even if you thought only one parent had actually killed the baby, if the other parent was an accomplice or complicit to the act, they could be tried and convicted of the actual murder as well, even if they didn't physically do it. So I found that to be interesting that I've heard about that twice now, but I had never heard about that before. Anyways, the couple was tried separately. It was decided that they be tried separately, and Diane was tried and subsequently convicted of capital murder in 1998. Shortly thereafter, David had his trial, and like Diane had done, he pointed the finger at her completely. He said that she actually did the murder and he wasn't even there, and that he then helped her conceal the evidence after the fact, since the gun was found in his house. But he too was convicted of capital murder. Because of Adrian Jones's family's request, neither David nor Diana were given the death penalty, so they both ended up getting life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years, which I believe will be in 2036 for both of them. And Adrian's family, man, that takes some strength, right? To be like, please don't give the death penalty to these kids, because they said that there had already been enough loss and we didn't need to lose any more young lives due to this situation. And I just see that as such like strength. And maybe they're religious, I don't know, but I can't imagine that I would be strong enough to be like, don't kill these kids, you know? I feel like I would, I don't know, you know? So they're just very strong people, because I cannot even imagine if somebody killed my daughter being big enough to just not want them dead too. So something I found interesting in this case is both the prosecution and the defense stated that they didn't believe that the sexual encounter between David and Adrian ever happened. I could imagine that for the prosecution, they maybe would want to do that to try to make Adrian look better, like her reputation to be better in the case. And I imagine with the defense that they would want to take the motive away. But I don't know. I don't know. In my opinion, I do think that they had a relationship, and let me tell you why. First, just the fact that David was able to get her out of the house to meet with him that late at night makes me think that there had to have been some sort of relationship there, because she's 16 years old, and I'm putting myself in the shoes of a 16-year-old girl. I've been there before, and I can't think of another reason that she would leave and meet up with a guy in the middle of the night if it wasn't somebody that she was interested in, okay? Additionally, the small details that Diane had said in her confession, like that the seat had been reclined back and that David was leaning over her, those details I feel were too specific to be faked. It seems like it was something that she noticed and it stuck in her head about that night, because this wasn't even in David's confession, but it stuck in Diane's head enough because it upset her enough, because it reminded her of what he had done, and I can't see why Adrian's seat would be back on that night if there hadn't already been something going on between them in the first place. But that's all just my opinion. So where are they now? Did their untouchable and so special and different love stand the test of time and stand up to being imprisoned? No. Initially, David and Diane would write each other love letters all the time, trying to keep their love and their relationship alive, kind of seeming like they thought they might get out of jail. But once the trial started, those letters stopped. Probably because they were turning on each other, you know? How are you going to stay in love with somebody when they are trying to rat you out for a murder that you both committed? So Diane Zamora is currently incarcerated at the Skyview Institute in Texas. I know that she had tried to appeal to get better housing or to be put in like solitary confinement, because she says that she is such a famous criminal and her case is so publicized that other inmates were attacking her, and she has reportedly become friends with, what is that woman's name? The bitch that killed Selena. Of course she is. In 2003, Diane married another inmate who had written her letters, and they never actually met, and they were married with like surrogates, I believe, but that marriage ended in 2010. David Graham is currently in custody in the Allred Institute in Texas. He too married, I believe, to another inmate, and that was in 2010, and he earned himself a bachelor's degree in criminology. I heard in an interview that he wants to reach out to Adrian's family, but they want none of that. He says that he's so sorry and that he loves them, and you know, I wouldn't talk to him either. Diane sticks to her story that she is an innocent victim and that everything was perpetrated by David because he was her controlling and abusive boyfriend. And though David, during the trial, did try to say everything was Diane, he has since admitted to his part in the murder, but he still insists that Diane was heavily involved, just like he had said in his initial confession. David has stated that he was stupid in love and that his arrest was actually a bit of a positive. Obviously the situation wasn't, but he says that he sees himself as being arrested as a positive because it allowed him to get out of the relationship with Diane. Love that. So that is the story of the love triangle that ended with a 16-year-old girl losing her life. It's crazy, right? When I was younger and I saw this movie and I heard of this case, I had no idea how young these people actually were. And maybe it's just because I'm 31 years old, but man, these are like kids, right? 16 to die? That's so young. And 17 and 18 to murder somebody? I mean, I know that this happens all the time, but I don't know. As like an adult woman, that just seems so incredibly young and so pointless. I know that they're all pointless, but just like, it's so stupid. They were so incredibly young, and I know when you're that age, everything just feels so intense and important, and everybody you love so hard because it's like the first time you've ever done it, but it was all literally for nothing, and they did it for a relationship they didn't even end up in. You know what I mean? They ended this girl's life. Her family will never get to see her grow up or get a career, graduate high school, get married, have kids. Any and all things she could have ever wanted to do, she can never do because these two kids murdered her literally over nothing. This just seems like a totally pointless and tragic loss of life that just should never have happened. And that's just bananas to me. Ass bananas. Anyways, guys, that completes this video. Please let me know down below any videos that you would like to see in the future, and let me know what you think about this case. Do you think Diane had more to do with it than she's saying? Who do you believe on this side? I'm really curious because I can see how some people would believe her. I just personally don't. So let me know down below. Do you think she was a victim? Do you think she was a leader? I kind of think she was a leader, because I didn't even mention throughout the video, I forgot, but she's the oldest sibling in her family, and he is the baby of his family. And I'm not saying that all oldest children end up being leaders, but we kind of are. I'm the oldest in my family, and I feel like I'm definitely kind of the leader. I don't know. Let me know. Please don't forget to join the Brat Pack by hitting the bell and subscribing, because I do put out new videos every week, and I would love to hang out with you. And thank you for being here when you could literally be anywhere else on the internet. I think that is amazing. You're tight, this is tight, and I hope to see you in my next video.